You guys ready?
You guys ready?
你们准备好了吗？
You guys ready?
You guys ready?
Great.
Great.
很好。
Great.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon, everybody.
大家下午好。
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon, everybody.
How are we?
How are we?
我们怎么样？
How are we?
How are we?
Good to see you all.
Good to see you all.
很高兴见到你们所有人。
Good to see you all.
Good to see you all.
I have a few announcements off the top today.
I have a few announcements off the top today.
我今天有一些开场的公告。
I have a few announcements off the top today.
I have a few announcements off the top today.
On April 14th, President Trump will welcome President Bukele of El Salvador for an official working visit here at the White House.
On April 14th, President Trump will welcome President Bukele of El Salvador for an official working visit here at the White House.
4月14日，特朗普总统将在白宫欢迎萨尔瓦多总统布克勒进行正式工作访问。
On April 14th, President Trump will welcome President Bukele of El Salvador for an official working visit here at the White House.
On April 14th, President Trump will welcome President Bukele of El Salvador for an official working visit here at the White House.
They will discuss El Salvador's partnership on using their Supermax prison for Tren de Aragua and MS-13 gang members and how El Salvador's cooperation with the United States has become a model for others to work with this administration.
They will discuss El Salvador's partnership on using their Supermax prison for Tren de Aragua and MS-13 gang members, and how El Salvador's cooperation with the United States has become a model for others to work with this administration.
他们将讨论萨尔瓦多在使用他们的超级监狱来关押 Tren de Aragua 和 MS-13帮派成员方面与美国的合作，以及萨尔瓦多与美国的合作已经成为其他国家与这一政府合作的典范。
They will discuss El Salvador's partnership on using their Supermax prison for Tren de Aragua and MS-13 gang members and how El Salvador's cooperation with the United States has become a model for others to work with this administration.
They will discuss El Salvador's partnership on using their Supermax prison for Tren de Aragua and MS-13 gang members, and how El Salvador's cooperation with the United States has become a model for others to work with this administration.
On April 17th, President Trump will welcome Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy for an official working visit at the White House as well.
On April 17th, President Trump will welcome Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy for an official working visit at the White House as well.
4月17日，特朗普总统将在白宫欢迎意大利总理吉奥瓦尼·梅洛尼进行正式工作访问。
On April 17th, President Trump will welcome Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy for an official working visit at the White House as well.
On April 17th, President Trump will welcome Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy for an official working visit at the White House as well.
The President's thoughts also remain with the families and communities experiencing devastating loss from the severe storms and flooding affected several states across the central U.S.
The President's thoughts also remain with the families and communities experiencing devastating loss from the severe storms and flooding affected several states across the central U.S.
总统也对遭受严重风暴和洪水影响的美国中西部几个州的家庭和社区所经历的巨大损失表示哀悼。
The President's thoughts also remain with the families and communities experiencing devastating loss from the severe storms and flooding affected several states across the central U.S.
The President's thoughts also remain with the families and communities experiencing devastating loss from the severe storms and flooding affected several states across the central U.S.
President Trump approved emergency declarations for Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee, allowing FEMA to provide federal assistance like equipment and resources to support state and local emergency response officials who are leading this response on the ground.
President Trump approved emergency declarations for Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee, allowing FEMA to provide federal assistance, like equipment and resources, to support state and local emergency response officials who are leading this response on the ground.
特朗普总统批准了阿肯色州、肯塔基州和田纳西州的紧急声明，允许联邦应急管理局提供联邦援助，如设备和资源，以支持在地面上领导这一响应的各州和地方政府官员。
President Trump approved emergency declarations for Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee, allowing FEMA to provide federal assistance like equipment and resources to support state and local emergency response officials who are leading this response on the ground.
President Trump approved emergency declarations for Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee, allowing FEMA to provide federal assistance, like equipment and resources, to support state and local emergency response officials who are leading this response on the ground.
Last night, the Supreme Court delivered a massive legal victory to the Trump administration and allowed us to continue removing foreign terrorist invaders under the Alien Enemies Act.
Last night, the Supreme Court delivered a massive legal victory to the Trump administration and allowed us to continue removing foreign terrorist invaders under the Alien Enemies Act.
昨晚，最高法院为特朗普政府赢得了重大法律胜利，并允许我们继续根据外国敌人法驱逐外国恐怖分子入侵者。
Last night, the Supreme Court delivered a massive legal victory to the Trump administration and allowed us to continue removing foreign terrorist invaders under the Alien Enemies Act.
Last night, the Supreme Court delivered a massive legal victory to the Trump administration and allowed us to continue removing foreign terrorist invaders under the Alien Enemies Act.
This was a smackdown to a rogue left-wing low-level district court judge who have relentlessly tried to stop President Trump from using his core constitutional powers as head of the executive branch and as commander-in-chief.
This was a smackdown to a rogue, left-wing, low-level district court judge who have relentlessly tried to stop President Trump from using his core constitutional powers as head of the executive branch and as commander-in-chief.
这是对一个叛逆的左翼的低级地区法官的一次重击，他们一直试图阻止特朗普总统行使作为行政首脑和总司令的核心宪法权利。
This was a smackdown to a rogue left-wing low-level district court judge who have relentlessly tried to stop President Trump from using his core constitutional powers as head of the executive branch and as commander-in-chief.
This was a smackdown to a rogue, left-wing, low-level district court judge who have relentlessly tried to stop President Trump from using his core constitutional powers as head of the executive branch and as commander-in-chief.
The highest court in the land made it clear that the President of the United States has the power to protect our homeland and forcibly remove foreign terrorists who pose a grave threat to families and communities.
The highest court in the land made it clear that the President of the United States has the power to protect our homeland and forcibly remove foreign terrorists who pose a grave threat to families and communities.
最高法院明确表示，美国总统有权保护我们的国土，并强制驱逐对家庭和社区构成严重威胁的外国恐怖分子。
The highest court in the land made it clear that the President of the United States has the power to protect our homeland and forcibly remove foreign terrorists who pose a grave threat to families and communities.
The highest court in the land made it clear that the President of the United States has the power to protect our homeland and forcibly remove foreign terrorists who pose a grave threat to families and communities.
Thank you to the Supreme Court for upholding the rule of law and protecting the Constitution.
Thank you to the Supreme Court for upholding the rule of law and protecting the Constitution.
感谢最高法院维护法律秩序并保护宪法。
Thank you to the Supreme Court for upholding the rule of law and protecting the Constitution.
Thank you to the Supreme Court for upholding the rule of law and protecting the Constitution.
Our message to the monster Tren de Aragua and MS-13 terrorists still hiding illegally inside our country is clear.
Our message to the monster Tren de Aragua and MS-13 terrorists still hiding illegally inside our country is clear.
对我们国家里仍然非法隐藏的 Monster、Tren de Aragua 和 MS-13恐怖分子的信息是明确的。
Our message to the monster Tren de Aragua and MS-13 terrorists still hiding illegally inside our country is clear.
Our message to the monster Tren de Aragua and MS-13 terrorists still hiding illegally inside our country is clear.
Deport yourself now, or you will be locked up and sent back to your home country.
Deport yourself now, or you will be locked up and sent back to your home country.
现在就自首，否则你将被关押并遣返回你的祖国。
Deport yourself now, or you will be locked up and sent back to your home country.
Deport yourself now, or you will be locked up and sent back to your home country.
On another matter, the historic Liberation Day announcement last week by President Trump made it very clear that the era of American economic surrender is over.
On another matter, the historic Liberation Day announcement last week by President Trump made it very clear that the era of American economic surrender is over.
在另一件事上， 特朗普总统上周宣布的解放日历史公告非常清楚地表明了美国经济投降的时代已经结束。
On another matter, the historic Liberation Day announcement last week by President Trump made it very clear that the era of American economic surrender is over.
On another matter, the historic Liberation Day announcement last week by President Trump made it very clear that the era of American economic surrender is over.
President Trump is no longer going to allow American workers and companies to be ripped off at the hands of foolish trade practices that shipped away millions of high-paying jobs and hollowed out communities across the country.
President Trump is no longer going to allow American workers and companies to be ripped off at the hands of foolish trade practices that shipped away millions of high-paying jobs and hollowed out communities across the country.
特朗普总统不再允许美国工人和公司被愚蠢的贸易做法所剥削，这些做法将数百万高薪工作和全国各地的社区掏空。
President Trump is no longer going to allow American workers and companies to be ripped off at the hands of foolish trade practices that shipped away millions of high-paying jobs and hollowed out communities across the country.
President Trump is no longer going to allow American workers and companies to be ripped off at the hands of foolish trade practices that shipped away millions of high-paying jobs and hollowed out communities across the country.
It's America first, all the way.
It's America first all the way.
这是美国优先到底。
It's America first, all the way.
It's America first all the way.
And despite fear-mongering by the media, the world is clearly responding to President Trump's approach.
And despite fear-mongering by the media, the world is clearly responding to President Trump's approach.
尽管媒体恐吓，世界显然正在对特朗普总统的这一做法做出反应。
And despite fear-mongering by the media, the world is clearly responding to President Trump's approach.
And despite fear-mongering by the media, the world is clearly responding to President Trump's approach.
Just yesterday, President Trump held a bilateral meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu here at the White House.
Just yesterday, President Trump held a bilateral meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu here at the White House.
就在昨天，特朗普总统在白宫与以色列总理本杰明·内塔尼亚胡举行了双边会晤。
Just yesterday, President Trump held a bilateral meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu here at the White House.
Just yesterday, President Trump held a bilateral meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu here at the White House.
The Prime Minister pledged to immediately eliminate America's trade deficit with Israel and remove their trade barrier.
The Prime Minister pledged to immediately eliminate America's trade deficit with Israel and remove their trade barriers.
总理承诺立即消除美国与以色列之间的贸易逆差，并取消他们的贸易壁垒。
The Prime Minister pledged to immediately eliminate America's trade deficit with Israel and remove their trade barrier.
The Prime Minister pledged to immediately eliminate America's trade deficit with Israel and remove their trade barriers.
Israel's proactive approach should serve as a model for the rest of the world.
Israel's proactive approach should serve as a model for the rest of the world.
以色列的积极做法应该成为世界其他地区的榜样。
Israel's proactive approach should serve as a model for the rest of the world.
Israel's proactive approach should serve as a model for the rest of the world.
Also yesterday, the president spoke with Japan's prime minister who wants to negotiate as well.
Also yesterday, the president spoke with Japan's prime minister who wants to negotiate as well.
同样在昨天，总统与日本首相进行了交谈，后者也想进行谈判。
Also yesterday, the president spoke with Japan's prime minister who wants to negotiate as well.
Also yesterday, the president spoke with Japan's prime minister who wants to negotiate as well.
The president also spoke to the acting president of South Korea this morning.
The president also spoke to the acting president of South Korea this morning.
总统今天早上还与韩国代理总统进行了交谈。
The president also spoke to the acting president of South Korea this morning.
The president also spoke to the acting president of South Korea this morning.
He has tasked Secretary Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer to lead these talks.
He has tasked Secretary Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer to lead these talks.
他已指派贝桑特国务卿和美国贸易代表詹姆斯·格雷尔领导这些会谈。
He has tasked Secretary Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer to lead these talks.
He has tasked Secretary Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer to lead these talks.
In total, since the Liberation Day announcement, nearly 70 countries have already reached out to the president to begin a negotiation.
In total, since the Liberation Day announcement, nearly 70 countries have already reached out to the president to begin a negotiation.
自解放日声明以来，已有近70个国家主动联系总统开始谈判。
In total, since the Liberation Day announcement, nearly 70 countries have already reached out to the president to begin a negotiation.
In total, since the Liberation Day announcement, nearly 70 countries have already reached out to the president to begin a negotiation.
Countries are falling over themselves to reform their unfair trade practices and free open their markets to our country.
Countries are falling over themselves to reform their unfair trade practices and free open their markets to our country.
各国纷纷急于改革其不公平的贸易做法，并向我们开放市场。
Countries are falling over themselves to reform their unfair trade practices and free open their markets to our country.
Countries are falling over themselves to reform their unfair trade practices and free open their markets to our country.
Why?
Why?
为什么？
Why?
Why?
Because these countries greatly respect President Trump in the sheer power of the American market.
Because these countries greatly respect President Trump in the sheer power of the American market.
因为这些国家非常尊重特朗普总统及其美国市场的巨大实力。
Because these countries greatly respect President Trump in the sheer power of the American market.
Because these countries greatly respect President Trump in the sheer power of the American market.
These countries realize they've gotten filthy rich over the past few decades by imposing substantial tariffs on American-made products and ridiculous non-monetary barriers to block out American industry.
These countries realize they've gotten filthy rich over the past few decades by imposing substantial tariffs on American-made products and ridiculous non-monetary barriers to block out American industry.
这些国家意识到，在过去几十年里，他们通过对美国制造的产品征收高额关税和设置荒谬的非货币壁垒来阻止美国工业进入，从而变得非常富裕。
These countries realize they've gotten filthy rich over the past few decades by imposing substantial tariffs on American-made products and ridiculous non-monetary barriers to block out American industry.
These countries realize they've gotten filthy rich over the past few decades by imposing substantial tariffs on American-made products and ridiculous non-monetary barriers to block out American industry.
The jig is up.
The jig is up.
好戏结束了。
The jig is up.
The jig is up.
Past American presidents sat by and let this happen, but President Trump stood up for our country and he is saying no more.
Past American presidents sat by and let this happen, but President Trump stood up for our country, and he is saying no more.
过去美国的总统们坐视不管，让这种事情发生，但特朗普总统为我们的国家站了出来，并表示不会再这样下去了。
Past American presidents sat by and let this happen, but President Trump stood up for our country and he is saying no more.
Past American presidents sat by and let this happen, but President Trump stood up for our country, and he is saying no more.
The president's message has been simple and consistent from the beginning.
The president's message has been simple and consistent from the beginning.
从一开始，总统的信息就一直简单而一致。
The president's message has been simple and consistent from the beginning.
The president's message has been simple and consistent from the beginning.
To countries around the world, bring us your best offers, and he will listen.
To countries around the world, bring us your best offers, and he will listen.
对世界各国来说，把你们最好的提议带给我们，他会倾听的。
To countries around the world, bring us your best offers, and he will listen.
To countries around the world, bring us your best offers, and he will listen.
Deals will only be made if they benefit American workers and address our nation's crippling trade deficits.
Deals will only be made if they benefit American workers and address our nation's crippling trade deficits.
只有当交易有利于美国工人，并解决我们国家令人窒息的贸易逆差时，才会达成交易。
Deals will only be made if they benefit American workers and address our nation's crippling trade deficits.
Deals will only be made if they benefit American workers and address our nation's crippling trade deficits.
America does not need other countries as much as other countries need us, and President Trump knows this.
America does not need other countries as much as other countries need us, and President Trump knows this.
美国不需要其他国家像其他国家需要它一样多，特朗普总统知道这一点。
America does not need other countries as much as other countries need us, and President Trump knows this.
America does not need other countries as much as other countries need us, and President Trump knows this.
He's going to use the leverage of our markets and our country to the advantage of the people he was sworn in to represent.
He's going to use the leverage of our markets and our country to the advantage of the people he was sworn in to represent.
他将利用我们的市场和国家的力量来为他宣誓代表的人民谋利。
He's going to use the leverage of our markets and our country to the advantage of the people he was sworn in to represent.
He's going to use the leverage of our markets and our country to the advantage of the people he was sworn in to represent.
On the other hand, countries like China, who have chosen to retaliate and try to double down on their mistreatment of American workers, are making a mistake.
On the other hand, countries like China, who have chosen to retaliate and try to double down on their mistreatment of American workers, are making a mistake.
另一方面，像中国这样的国家选择报复并试图加倍对待美国工人的不当行为，这是错误的。
On the other hand, countries like China, who have chosen to retaliate and try to double down on their mistreatment of American workers, are making a mistake.
On the other hand, countries like China, who have chosen to retaliate and try to double down on their mistreatment of American workers, are making a mistake.
President Trump has a spine of steel, and he will not break.
President Trump has a spine of steel and he will not break.
特朗普总统有一颗钢铁般的脊梁，他不会屈服。
President Trump has a spine of steel, and he will not break.
President Trump has a spine of steel and he will not break.
And America will not break under his leadership.
And America will not break under his leadership.
在美国的领导下，美国不会在任何情况下崩溃。
And America will not break under his leadership.
And America will not break under his leadership.
He is guided by a firm belief that America must be able to produce essential goods for our own people and export them to the rest of the world.
He is guided by a firm belief that America must be able to produce essential goods for our own people and export them to the rest of the world.
他坚信美国必须能够为自己的人民生产必要的商品，并将它们出口到世界各地。这一坚定的信念指导着他。
He is guided by a firm belief that America must be able to produce essential goods for our own people and export them to the rest of the world.
He is guided by a firm belief that America must be able to produce essential goods for our own people and export them to the rest of the world.
A strong America cannot be solely dependent on foreign countries for our food, medicines, and critical minerals. And America must always maintain a robust defense supply chain.
A strong America cannot be solely dependent on foreign countries for our food, medicines, and critical minerals, and America must always maintain a robust defense supply chain.
一个强大的美国不能仅仅依赖外国国家为我们提供食物、药品和关键矿物。美国必须始终维护强大的国防供应链。
A strong America cannot be solely dependent on foreign countries for our food, medicines, and critical minerals. And America must always maintain a robust defense supply chain.
A strong America cannot be solely dependent on foreign countries for our food, medicines, and critical minerals, and America must always maintain a robust defense supply chain.
Prioritizing and strengthening our manufacturing industry are essential national and economic security issues of the utmost importance to President Trump.
Reprioritizing and strengthening our manufacturing industry are essential national and economic security issues of the utmost importance to President Trump.
重新优先考虑并加强我们的制造业是特朗普总统极其重视的国家和经济安全问题。
Prioritizing and strengthening our manufacturing industry are essential national and economic security issues of the utmost importance to President Trump.
Reprioritizing and strengthening our manufacturing industry are essential national and economic security issues of the utmost importance to President Trump.
By focusing on supercharging the onshoring of American manufacturing, the President is already delivering on his promise to usher in an economic golden age for our country.
By focusing on supercharging the onshoring of American manufacturing, the President is already delivering on his promise to usher in an economic golden age for our country.
通过专注于加速将美国制造业留在国内，总统已经在兑现他为我们的国家带来经济黄金时代的承诺。
By focusing on supercharging the onshoring of American manufacturing, the President is already delivering on his promise to usher in an economic golden age for our country.
By focusing on supercharging the onshoring of American manufacturing, the President is already delivering on his promise to usher in an economic golden age for our country.
Just look at Friday's jobs report, which smashed expectations for the second straight month.
Just look at Friday's jobs report, which smashed expectations for the second straight month.
只需看看上周五的就业报告，连续第2个月打破了预期。
Just look at Friday's jobs report, which smashed expectations for the second straight month.
Just look at Friday's jobs report, which smashed expectations for the second straight month.
The American economy added 228,000 jobs, nearly 100,000 more jobs than economists predicted, and the fourth highest month for private payroll growth in the past 2 years.
The American economy added 228,000 jobs, nearly 100,000 more jobs than economists predicted, and the fourth highest month for private payroll growth in the past 2 years.
美国经济增加了 22.8 万个就业岗位，比经济学家预测的多近10万个，是过去2年私人薪酬增长第4高的月份。
The American economy added 228,000 jobs, nearly 100,000 more jobs than economists predicted, and the fourth highest month for private payroll growth in the past 2 years.
The American economy added 228,000 jobs, nearly 100,000 more jobs than economists predicted, and the fourth highest month for private payroll growth in the past 2 years.
There was also a sharp increase in transportation, construction, and warehousing employment.
There was also a sharp increase in transportation, construction, and warehousing employment.
运输、建筑和仓储就业也出现了大幅增加。
There was also a sharp increase in transportation, construction, and warehousing employment.
There was also a sharp increase in transportation, construction, and warehousing employment.
And in just 11 weeks, President Trump has secured more than $1.5 trillion in private sector investment.
And in just 11 weeks, President Trump has secured more than $1.5 trillion in private sector investment.
仅仅在11周内，特朗普总统就确保了超过 1.5 万亿美元的私营部门投资。
And in just 11 weeks, President Trump has secured more than $1.5 trillion in private sector investment.
And in just 11 weeks, President Trump has secured more than $1.5 trillion in private sector investment.
This is $500 billion more than Joe Biden secured in his entire term.
This is $500 billion more than Joe Biden secured in his entire term.
这比乔拜登在其整个任期内获得的多出1半的金额。
This is $500 billion more than Joe Biden secured in his entire term.
This is $500 billion more than Joe Biden secured in his entire term.
This record-breaking private sector investment will create roughly 350,000 American jobs and counting.
This record-breaking private sector investment will create roughly 350,000 American jobs and counting.
这一创纪录的私营部门投资将创造大约35万个美国就业岗位，并且还在增加中。
This record-breaking private sector investment will create roughly 350,000 American jobs and counting.
This record-breaking private sector investment will create roughly 350,000 American jobs and counting.
If you add up all of the investment pledges from foreign governments, President Trump has secured an incredible $5 trillion in total investments already.
If you add up all of the investment pledges from foreign governments, President Trump has secured an incredible $5 trillion in total investments already.
如果你把所有来自外国政府的投资承诺加起来，特朗普总统已经确保了总计5万亿美元的投资。
If you add up all of the investment pledges from foreign governments, President Trump has secured an incredible $5 trillion in total investments already.
If you add up all of the investment pledges from foreign governments, President Trump has secured an incredible $5 trillion in total investments already.
In the months ahead, President Trump's pro-growth economic agenda will be fully realized.
In the months ahead, President Trump's pro-growth economic agenda will be fully realized.
在未来几个月里，特朗普总统的促增长经济议程将完全实现。
In the months ahead, President Trump's pro-growth economic agenda will be fully realized.
In the months ahead, President Trump's pro-growth economic agenda will be fully realized.
The largest deregulatory effort in American history is underway.
The largest deregulatory effort in American history is underway.
美国历史上最大的去监管行动正在进行中。
The largest deregulatory effort in American history is underway.
The largest deregulatory effort in American history is underway.
Unnecessary, burdensome, costly red tape is being eliminated by this entire federal government every day, driving down costs and massively boosting small businesses.
Unnecessary, burdensome, costly red tape is being eliminated by this entire federal government every day, driving down costs and massively boosting small businesses.
不必要的、 繁重的、昂贵的官僚主义正在整个联邦政府每天被限制，从而降低成本并大幅提振小型企业。
Unnecessary, burdensome, costly red tape is being eliminated by this entire federal government every day, driving down costs and massively boosting small businesses.
Unnecessary, burdensome, costly red tape is being eliminated by this entire federal government every day, driving down costs and massively boosting small businesses.
So far, President Trump's deregulation effort has already saved Americans more than $180 billion, equivalent to $2,100 per family of four.
So far, President Trump's deregulation effort has already saved Americans more than $180 billion, equivalent to $2,100 per family of four.
到目前为止，特朗普总统的去监管努力已经为美国人节省了超过1800亿美元，相当于每个4口之家节省了2100美元。
So far, President Trump's deregulation effort has already saved Americans more than $180 billion, equivalent to $2,100 per family of four.
So far, President Trump's deregulation effort has already saved Americans more than $180 billion, equivalent to $2,100 per family of four.
The president's drill baby drill energy agenda, which he will discuss later this evening in the East Room, is capitalizing on the abundance of natural resources under our feet to generate more affordable electricity, cheap gas, and quality new jobs.
The president's drill baby, drill energy agenda, which he will discuss later this evening in the East Room, is capitalizing on the abundance of natural resources under our feet to generate more affordable electricity, cheap gas, and quality new jobs.
总统的钻吧，宝贝能源议程，他将在今晚晚些时候在东厅讨论的内容，正在利用我们脚下丰富的自然资源来产生更实惠的电力、便宜的天然气和高质量的新就业岗位。
The president's drill baby drill energy agenda, which he will discuss later this evening in the East Room, is capitalizing on the abundance of natural resources under our feet to generate more affordable electricity, cheap gas, and quality new jobs.
The president's drill baby, drill energy agenda, which he will discuss later this evening in the East Room, is capitalizing on the abundance of natural resources under our feet to generate more affordable electricity, cheap gas, and quality new jobs.
All of this will combine to end the Biden-imposed cost of living crisis that's absolutely crushed American families.
All of this will combine to end the Biden-imposed cost of living crisis that's absolutely crushed American families.
所有这些都将结合在一起，结束拜登强加的生活成本危机，这绝对摧毁了美国家庭。
All of this will combine to end the Biden-imposed cost of living crisis that's absolutely crushed American families.
All of this will combine to end the Biden-imposed cost of living crisis that's absolutely crushed American families.
Under President Trump, the American energy industry will lead the globe over the next century, delivering lower prices and significantly strengthening our country's economic position.
Under President Trump, the American energy industry will lead the globe over the next century, delivering lower prices and significantly strengthening our country's economic position.
在特朗普总统的领导下，美国能源行业将在未来1个世纪引领全球，提供更低的价格，并显著加强我们国家的经济地位。
Under President Trump, the American energy industry will lead the globe over the next century, delivering lower prices and significantly strengthening our country's economic position.
Under President Trump, the American energy industry will lead the globe over the next century, delivering lower prices and significantly strengthening our country's economic position.
At the president's direction, Republicans in Congress are working quickly to pass one big beautiful bill, which will also include the largest tax cut in American history.
At the president's direction, Republicans in Congress are working quickly to pass one big, beautiful bill, which will also include the largest tax cut in American history.
在总统的指示下，国会中的共和党人正在迅速推动通过一项大而美丽的法案，该法案还将包括美国历史上最大的减税。
At the president's direction, Republicans in Congress are working quickly to pass one big beautiful bill, which will also include the largest tax cut in American history.
At the president's direction, Republicans in Congress are working quickly to pass one big, beautiful bill, which will also include the largest tax cut in American history.
As President Trump has said, the House must pass this budget resolution quickly.
As President Trump has said, the House must pass this budget resolution quickly.
正如特朗普总统所说，众议院必须尽快通过这个预算决议。
As President Trump has said, the House must pass this budget resolution quickly.
As President Trump has said, the House must pass this budget resolution quickly.
Here in our new media seat today, we have Jasmine Wright, the White House reporter for Notice.
Here in our new media seat today, we have Jasmine Wright, the White House reporter for Notice.
在今天的新闻媒体中心，我们有 Jasmine Wright, Notice 的白宫记者。
Here in our new media seat today, we have Jasmine Wright, the White House reporter for Notice.
Here in our new media seat today, we have Jasmine Wright, the White House reporter for Notice.
Notice is a nonprofit and nonpartisan news site which launched in early 2024.
Notice is a nonprofit and nonpartisan news site which launched in early 2024.
Notice 是一个非盈利、无党派新闻网站，于2024年初上线。
Notice is a nonprofit and nonpartisan news site which launched in early 2024.
Notice is a nonprofit and nonpartisan news site which launched in early 2024.
They've gained millions of readers across the country since.
They've gained millions of readers across the country since.
自那以后，他们在全国范围内获得了数百万读者。
They've gained millions of readers across the country since.
They've gained millions of readers across the country since.
The newsroom's goal is both to inform readers and train the next generation of politics and policy journalists.
Newsroom's goal is both to inform readers and train the next generation of politics and policy journalists.
新闻室的目标是既向读者提供信息，也培养下一代政治和政策记者。
The newsroom's goal is both to inform readers and train the next generation of politics and policy journalists.
Newsroom's goal is both to inform readers and train the next generation of politics and policy journalists.
They also partner with state newsrooms to give local communities more knowledge of what their representatives are doing in Washington, D.C.
They also partner with state newsrooms to give local communities more knowledge of what their representatives are doing in Washington, D.C.
他们还与州级新闻室合作，让当地社区更多地了解他们的代表在华盛顿特区所做的工作。
They also partner with state newsrooms to give local communities more knowledge of what their representatives are doing in Washington, D.C.
They also partner with state newsrooms to give local communities more knowledge of what their representatives are doing in Washington, D.C.
With that, please kick us off, Jasmine.
With that, please kick us off, Jasmine.
好了，请 Jasmine 开始提问吧。
With that, please kick us off, Jasmine.
With that, please kick us off, Jasmine.
Thanks so much, Caroline.
Thanks so much, Caroline.
非常感谢你 Caroline.
Thanks so much, Caroline.
Thanks so much, Caroline.
A couple questions for you.
A couple questions for you.
有几个问题想问你。
A couple questions for you.
A couple questions for you.
First one being, can you explain the White House's evolution from this is not a negotiation on tariffs to countries should pitch us and start negotiations on
The first one being, can you explain the White House's evolution from this is not a negotiation on tariffs to countries should pitch us and start negotiations on tariffs?
第一个问题是，你能解释一下白宫从这不是关于关税的谈判到国家应该向我们提出并开始关于关税的谈判的转变吗？
The first one being, can you explain the White House's evolution from this is not a negotiation on tariffs to countries should pitch us and start negotiations on
The first one being, can you explain the White House's evolution from this is not a negotiation on tariffs to countries should pitch us and start negotiations on tariffs?
Sure.
Sure.
当然，
Sure.
Sure.
As the president said yesterday, Jasmine, both things can be true at the same time.
As the president said yesterday, Jasmine, both things can be true at the same time.
正如总统昨天所说 ，Jasmine，这两件事可以同时存在。
As the president said yesterday, Jasmine, both things can be true at the same time.
As the president said yesterday, Jasmine, both things can be true at the same time.
And it is a non-negotiable position that the United States has faced a national security and economic crisis because of the unfair trade practices by countries around the world.
And it is a non-negotiable position that the United States has faced a national security and economic crisis because of the unfair trade practices by countries around the world.
这是不可谈判的立场。由于世界各国不公平的贸易做法，美国面临国家安全和经济危机。
And it is a non-negotiable position that the United States has faced a national security and economic crisis because of the unfair trade practices by countries around the world.
And it is a non-negotiable position that the United States has faced a national security and economic crisis because of the unfair trade practices by countries around the world.
As for the president, I have maintained this position.
As for the president, I have maintained this position.
至于总统，我一直坚持这个立场。
As for the president, I have maintained this position.
As for the president, I have maintained this position.
The entire administration has always said that President Trump is willing to pick up the phone and talk.
The entire administration has always said that President Trump is willing to pick up the phone and talk.
整个政府一直说特朗普总统愿意接电话并进行交谈。
The entire administration has always said that President Trump is willing to pick up the phone and talk.
The entire administration has always said that President Trump is willing to pick up the phone and talk.
And the president met with his trade team this morning, and he directed them to have tailor-made trade deals with each and every country that calls up this administration to strike a deal.
And the president met with his trade team this morning, and he directed them to have tailor-made trade deals with each and every country that calls up this administration to strike a deal.
今天早上，总统与他的贸易团队会面，并指示他们与每一个打电话给这个政府寻求交易的国家进行量身定制的贸易协议。
And the president met with his trade team this morning, and he directed them to have tailor-made trade deals with each and every country that calls up this administration to strike a deal.
And the president met with his trade team this morning, and he directed them to have tailor-made trade deals with each and every country that calls up this administration to strike a deal.
And listen, and each and every one of these trade deals should be tailored and unique based on that country's markets, based on that country's exports, the imports here in the United States of America.
And listen, each and every one of these trade deals should be tailored and unique based on that country's markets, based on that country's exports, the imports here in the United States of America.
听着，每一个这些贸易协议都应该根据该国的市场、该国的出口以及美国进口量身定制。
And listen, and each and every one of these trade deals should be tailored and unique based on that country's markets, based on that country's exports, the imports here in the United States of America.
And listen, each and every one of these trade deals should be tailored and unique based on that country's markets, based on that country's exports, the imports here in the United States of America.
What makes the most sense for the American worker and for our industry?
What makes the most sense for the American worker and for our industry?
什么对美国工人和我们的行业最合理？
What makes the most sense for the American worker and for our industry?
What makes the most sense for the American worker and for our industry?
The president is focused on putting America first.
The president is focused on putting America first.
总统专注于把美国放在首位。
The president is focused on putting America first.
The president is focused on putting America first.
Was the evolution not factored in or determined by kind of the tumult in the stock market?
So was the evolution not factored in or determined by kind of the tumult in the stock market?
那么，这种演变是否没有考虑到或由股市的动荡所决定？
So was the evolution not factored in or determined by kind of the tumult in the stock market?
So was the evolution not factored in or determined by kind of the tumult in the stock market?
Was that not a part of the consideration to start making these negotiations and deals?
Was that not a part of the consideration to start making these negotiations and deals?
这是否是开始进行这些谈判和交易时考虑的一部分？
Was that not a part of the consideration to start making these negotiations and deals?
Was that not a part of the consideration to start making these negotiations and deals?
Again, I would reject that there was an evolution.
Again, I would reject that there was an evolution.
再次，我拒绝接受这种演变。
Again, I would reject that there was an evolution.
Again, I would reject that there was an evolution.
On day one, we had said that the president will always pick up the phone for other nations and other companies that call this administration.
On day one, we had said that the president will always pick up the phone for other nations and other companies that call this administration.
从第一天开始，我们就说过，总统会接听其他国家和公司打给这个政府的电话。
On day one, we had said that the president will always pick up the phone for other nations and other companies that call this administration.
On day one, we had said that the president will always pick up the phone for other nations and other companies that call this administration.
The president always has a listening ear.
The president always has a listening ear.
总统总是愿意倾听。
The president always has a listening ear.
The president always has a listening ear.
And it's a non-negotiable fact that America has faced a national security and economic crisis for many decades.
And it's a non-negotiable fact that America has faced a national security and economic crisis for many decades.
美国面临国家安全和经济危机这一事实是不可谈判的，这种情况已经持续了数十年。
And it's a non-negotiable fact that America has faced a national security and economic crisis for many decades.
And it's a non-negotiable fact that America has faced a national security and economic crisis for many decades.
President Trump is just the first to address this.
And President Trump is just the first to address this.
特朗普总统只是第一个解决这个问题的人。
And President Trump is just the first to address this.
And President Trump is just the first to address this.
And then my last question.
And then my last question.
最后一个问题，
And then my last question.
And then my last question.
How will negotiations change how much revenue the White House is planning to make from the tariffs?
How will negotiations change how much revenue the White House is planning to make from the tariffs?
谈判将如何改变白宫计划从关税中获得的收入？
How will negotiations change how much revenue the White House is planning to make from the tariffs?
How will negotiations change how much revenue the White House is planning to make from the tariffs?
Well, that has yet to be seen.
Well, that has yet to be seen.
这还有待观察。
Well, that has yet to be seen.
Well, that has yet to be seen.
But as the president said, the reciprocal tariffs, which will continue to go in effect as these deals are negotiated and ongoing, will generate trillions of dollars in revenue to the United States.
But as the president said, the reciprocal tariffs, which will continue to go in effect as these deals are negotiated and ongoing, will generate trillions of dollars in revenue to the United States.
但正如总统所说，相互的关税将继续生效，并在这些交易谈判和进行中产生数万亿美元的收入给美国。
But as the president said, the reciprocal tariffs, which will continue to go in effect as these deals are negotiated and ongoing, will generate trillions of dollars in revenue to the United States.
But as the president said, the reciprocal tariffs, which will continue to go in effect as these deals are negotiated and ongoing, will generate trillions of dollars in revenue to the United States.
And this is twofold.
And this is twofold.
这是两方面的。
And this is twofold.
And this is twofold.
The president wants to onshore jobs here to the United States of America.
The president wants to onshore jobs here to the United States of America.
总统希望将工作岗位留在美国。
The president wants to onshore jobs here to the United States of America.
The president wants to onshore jobs here to the United States of America.
He wants to boost our manufacturing industry.
He wants to boost our manufacturing industry.
他想提振我们的制造业。
He wants to boost our manufacturing industry.
He wants to boost our manufacturing industry.
He also wants to tackle these crippling deficits with almost every single country around the world.
He also wants to tackle these crippling deficits with almost every single country around the world.
他还想解决与世界上几乎每一个国家的巨额赤字问题。
He also wants to tackle these crippling deficits with almost every single country around the world.
He also wants to tackle these crippling deficits with almost every single country around the world. Jackie.
杰基，
Jackie.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline.
谢谢，卡罗琳。
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline.
The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, warned that some of these negotiations might take up to months, that we could be doing this through April, May, and into June.
The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, warned that some of these negotiations might take up to months, that we could be doing this through April, May, and into June.
财政部长斯科特·巴恩斯警告说，这些谈判可能需要几个月的时间，我们可能会一直进行到4月、5月甚至6月。
The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, warned that some of these negotiations might take up to months, that we could be doing this through April, May, and into June.
The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, warned that some of these negotiations might take up to months, that we could be doing this through April, May, and into June.
And then you had Kevin Hassett say it's going to take a lot for the president to put his signature on the line, so he wants to make sure there's a good deal for America.
And then you had Kevin Hassett say it's going to take a lot for the president to put his signature on the line because he wants to make sure there's a good deal for America.
然后凯文·哈塞特说，总统在签署之前需要很多东西，因为他想确保对美国来说有一个好的交易。
And then you had Kevin Hassett say it's going to take a lot for the president to put his signature on the line, so he wants to make sure there's a good deal for America.
And then you had Kevin Hassett say it's going to take a lot for the president to put his signature on the line because he wants to make sure there's a good deal for America.
Is the president operating on any sort of a timeline or deadline where he wants this completed by?
Is the president operating on any sort of a timeline or deadline where he wants this completed by?
总统是否在任何时间表或截止日期上运作？他希望在这个完成。
Is the president operating on any sort of a timeline or deadline where he wants this completed by?
Is the president operating on any sort of a timeline or deadline where he wants this completed by?
Well, we always move at Trump speed here at the White House, which is incredibly fast.
Well, we always move at Trump speed here at the White House, which is incredibly fast.
在白宫，我们总是以特朗普的速度进行，这非常快。
Well, we always move at Trump speed here at the White House, which is incredibly fast.
Well, we always move at Trump speed here at the White House, which is incredibly fast.
I know you all know that from covering this White House day to day.
I know you all know that from covering this White House day to day.
我知道你们都从每天报道这个白宫中知道这一点。
I know you all know that from covering this White House day to day.
I know you all know that from covering this White House day to day.
The president likes to get things done.
The president likes to get things done.
总统喜欢把事情办好。
The president likes to get things done.
The president likes to get things done.
But he's very much focused on ensuring that these deals are good for the American worker, they are good for American manufacturing, and again, that they tackle these crippling deficits with these countries.
But he's very much focused on ensuring that these deals are good for the American worker, they are good for American manufacturing, and again that they tackle these crippling deficits with these countries.
但他非常专注于确保这些交易对美国工人、美国制造业都有好处。在此，他们解决了与这些国家的巨额赤字问题。
But he's very much focused on ensuring that these deals are good for the American worker, they are good for American manufacturing, and again that they tackle these crippling deficits with these countries.
But he's very much focused on ensuring that these deals are good for the American worker, they are good for American manufacturing, and again that they tackle these crippling deficits with these countries.
All options are on the table for each country.
All options are on the table for each country.
每个国家的所有选项都在桌面上。
All options are on the table for each country.
All options are on the table for each country.
But again, these are going to be tailor-made deals.
But again, these are going to be tailor-made deals.
但在此，这些都是量身定做的交易。
But again, these are going to be tailor-made deals.
But again, these are going to be tailor-made deals.
They are not going to be off-the-rack deals, as the president has called it.
They are not going to be off-the-rack deals, as the president has called it.
他们不会是总统所说的现成交易。
They are not going to be off-the-rack deals, as the president has called it.
They are not going to be off-the-rack deals, as the president has called it.
And he has directed his entire trade team to be part of this effort.
And he has directed his entire trade team to be part of this effort.
他已经指示他的整个贸易团队参与这项工作。
And he has directed his entire trade team to be part of this effort.
And he has directed his entire trade team to be part of this effort.
That includes Secretary Besson and our National Economic Director, Kevin Hassett.
So that includes Secretary Besson and our National Economic Director, Kevin Hassett.
因此，这包括商务部长伯恩和我们的国家经济主任凯文·哈塞特。
So that includes Secretary Besson and our National Economic Director, Kevin Hassett.
So that includes Secretary Besson and our National Economic Director, Kevin Hassett.
It also includes Secretary Lutnick, Peter Navarro, the entire trade team, Jamison Greer, who was on the Hill today.
It also includes Secretary Lutnick, Peter Navarro, the entire trade team, Jamison Greer, who was on the Hill today.
还包括卢廷克秘书彼得·纳瓦罗以及整个贸易团队杰米森·格雷今天在山上。
It also includes Secretary Lutnick, Peter Navarro, the entire trade team, Jamison Greer, who was on the Hill today.
It also includes Secretary Lutnick, Peter Navarro, the entire trade team, Jamison Greer, who was on the Hill today.
Everybody who is involved in this incredible, fair, reciprocal trade agenda will continue to be involved in negotiating these deals.
Everybody who is involved in this incredible, fair, reciprocal trade agenda will continue to be involved in negotiating these deals.
所有参与这个令人难以置信的公平互惠贸易议程的人都将继续参与这些交易的谈判。
Everybody who is involved in this incredible, fair, reciprocal trade agenda will continue to be involved in negotiating these deals.
Everybody who is involved in this incredible, fair, reciprocal trade agenda will continue to be involved in negotiating these deals.
And then yesterday, Goldman Sachs put out a research note.
Yesterday, Goldman Sachs put out a research note.
昨天，高盛发布了一份研究报告。
And then yesterday, Goldman Sachs put out a research note.
Yesterday, Goldman Sachs put out a research note.
It put the odds of a recession at 45% within the next 12 months, up from 35%.
It put the odds of a recession at 45% within the next 12 months, up from 35%.
它将未来1年内出现衰退的概率从35%提高到了45%。
It put the odds of a recession at 45% within the next 12 months, up from 35%.
It put the odds of a recession at 45% within the next 12 months, up from 35%.
But Peter Navarro guaranteed last night no recession.
But Peter Navarro guaranteed last night no recession.
但彼得·纳瓦罗昨晚保证不会出现经济衰退。
But Peter Navarro guaranteed last night no recession.
But Peter Navarro guaranteed last night no recession.
Does the president agree with him on that?
Does the president agree with him on that?
总统是否同意他的观点？
Does the president agree with him on that?
Does the president agree with him on that?
I know the president in the past has been leery of making definitive statements on that.
I know the president in the past has been leery of making definitive statements on that.
我知道过去总统对就这一问题做出明确的声明有所保留。
I know the president in the past has been leery of making definitive statements on that.
I know the president in the past has been leery of making definitive statements on that.
I can speak for the president, and I can speak for the optimism that he sees in our economy every day.
I can speak for the president, and I can speak for the optimism that he sees in our economy every day.
我可以代表总统说话，也可以代表他每天在经济中看到的乐观态度。
I can speak for the president, and I can speak for the optimism that he sees in our economy every day.
I can speak for the president, and I can speak for the optimism that he sees in our economy every day.
Again, when you talk about the massive deregulatory efforts that are happening across the board, when you talk about how oil prices are down, gas prices are down, egg prices are down, we're cutting costs for the American worker, for the American consumer.
Again, when you talk about the massive deregulatory efforts that are happening across the board, when you talk about how oil prices are down, gas prices are down, egg prices are down, we're cutting costs for the American worker, for the American consumer.
再次，当你谈到正在进行的全面大规模解除监管的努力时，当你谈到油价、汽油价格和鸡蛋价格都在下降时，我们正在为美国工人和消费者削减成本。
Again, when you talk about the massive deregulatory efforts that are happening across the board, when you talk about how oil prices are down, gas prices are down, egg prices are down, we're cutting costs for the American worker, for the American consumer.
Again, when you talk about the massive deregulatory efforts that are happening across the board, when you talk about how oil prices are down, gas prices are down, egg prices are down, we're cutting costs for the American worker, for the American consumer.
We also see trillions of dollars of investments pouring into this country every day, and we're working hard now on the tariff side of the president's economic agenda.
We also see trillions of dollars of investments pouring into this country every day, and we're working hard now on the tariff side of the president's economic agenda.
我们也每天看到数万亿美元的投资涌入这个国家，并且我们正在努力处理总统经济议程上的关税问题。
We also see trillions of dollars of investments pouring into this country every day, and we're working hard now on the tariff side of the president's economic agenda.
We also see trillions of dollars of investments pouring into this country every day, and we're working hard now on the tariff side of the president's economic agenda.
But don't forget, the next side of this is tax cuts, and we're counting on Capitol Hill to get those done, the largest tax cuts in history.
But don't forget, the next side of this is tax cuts, and we're counting on Capitol Hill to get those done, the largest tax cuts in history.
但请记住，这另一面是减税，我们期待国会山完成这一历史性的最大规模减税。
But don't forget, the next side of this is tax cuts, and we're counting on Capitol Hill to get those done, the largest tax cuts in history.
But don't forget, the next side of this is tax cuts, and we're counting on Capitol Hill to get those done, the largest tax cuts in history.
Does that mean that without those tax cuts coming through, that the likelihood of a recession is greater?
Does that mean that without those tax cuts coming through, that the likelihood of a recession is greater?
这意味着，如果没有这些减税措施的实施，经济衰退的可能性会更大吗？
Does that mean that without those tax cuts coming through, that the likelihood of a recession is greater?
Does that mean that without those tax cuts coming through, that the likelihood of a recession is greater?
That's not what I said.
No, that's not what I said.
不，我并没有这么说。
That's not what I said.
No, that's not what I said.
I'm just saying be mindful of the whole of government economic approach that this administration is taking every day.
I'm just saying be mindful of the whole of government economic approach that this administration is taking every day.
我只是想提醒大家注意这个政府每天采取的全面经济政策方法。
I'm just saying be mindful of the whole of government economic approach that this administration is taking every day.
I'm just saying be mindful of the whole of government economic approach that this administration is taking every day.
Sure.
Sure.
当然，
Sure.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
请说。
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline.
谢谢你，卡罗琳。
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline.
You just said that one of the reasons these tariffs are going into effect is that some countries have been ripping off the United States.
You just said that one of the reasons these tariffs are going into effect is that some countries have been ripping off the United States.
你刚才说这些关税生效的原因之一是有些国家一直在欺骗美国。
You just said that one of the reasons these tariffs are going into effect is that some countries have been ripping off the United States.
You just said that one of the reasons these tariffs are going into effect is that some countries have been ripping off the United States.
But some of the tariffs target countries like Madagascar, Bangladesh, with very high levels of poverty.
But some of the tariffs target countries like Madagascar, Bangladesh with very high levels of poverty.
但有些关税针对的是像马达加斯加、孟加拉国这样的贫困率很高的国家。
But some of the tariffs target countries like Madagascar, Bangladesh, with very high levels of poverty.
But some of the tariffs target countries like Madagascar, Bangladesh with very high levels of poverty.
So, can you explain how the president wants to correct the deficit with those countries?
So, can you explain how the president wants to correct the deficits with those countries?
那么，你能解释一下总统如何通过这些国家来纠正赤字吗？
So, can you explain how the president wants to correct the deficit with those countries?
So, can you explain how the president wants to correct the deficits with those countries?
Is there a plan, for example, to onshore the textile industry that these countries are known because?
Is there a plan, for example, to ensure the textile industry that these countries are known because?
例如，有没有计划确保这些国家因为他们的纺织业而闻名呢？
Is there a plan, for example, to onshore the textile industry that these countries are known because?
Is there a plan, for example, to ensure the textile industry that these countries are known because?
You know, just like, can you be specific about those, like, low income?
And just like, can you be specific about those, like, low-income countries?
而且，你知道，你能具体说明一下那些低收入国家吗？
You know, just like, can you be specific about those, like, low income?
And just like, can you be specific about those, like, low-income countries? Sure.
当然，
Sure.
Well, first of all, the reciprocal tariff rates that were implemented by country were focused on the monetary tariff that those countries have imposed on the United States, but also the non-monetary tariff barriers and the regulations, if you will, that have been put into effect over the years.
Well, first of all, the reciprocal tariff rates that were implemented by country were focused on the monetary tariff that those countries have imposed on the United States, but also the non-monetary tariff barriers and the regulations, if you will, that have been put into effect over the years.
首先，各国实施的相互关税率集中在这些国家对美国征收的货币关税上，但同时也包括非货币关税壁垒和多年来制定的各种规定。
Well, first of all, the reciprocal tariff rates that were implemented by country were focused on the monetary tariff that those countries have imposed on the United States, but also the non-monetary tariff barriers and the regulations, if you will, that have been put into effect over the years.
Well, first of all, the reciprocal tariff rates that were implemented by country were focused on the monetary tariff that those countries have imposed on the United States, but also the non-monetary tariff barriers and the regulations, if you will, that have been put into effect over the years.
Making it harder for America to export to these countries.
Making it harder for America to export to these countries.
使得美国难以向这些国家出口产品。
Making it harder for America to export to these countries.
Making it harder for America to export to these countries.
These were very carefully crafted numbers.
These were very carefully crafted numbers.
这些都是精心计算的数字。
These were very carefully crafted numbers.
These were very carefully crafted numbers.
There was also a 10% baseline tariff across the board as well, as you know.
There was also a 10% baseline tariff across the board as well, as you know.
你可能也知道，还有10%的普遍基准关税。
There was also a 10% baseline tariff across the board as well, as you know.
There was also a 10% baseline tariff across the board as well, as you know.
Moving forward, the president will talk to any country that picks up the phone to call.
Moving forward, the president will talk to any country that picks up the phone to call.
向前看，总统会与任何拿起电话回拨的国家进行交谈。
Moving forward, the president will talk to any country that picks up the phone to call.
Moving forward, the president will talk to any country that picks up the phone to call.
And I can tell you the phones have been ringing off the hook, wanting to talk to this administration, this president, and his trade team to try to strike a deal.
And I can tell you the phones have been ringing off the hook, wanting to talk to this administration, this president, and his trade team to try to strike a deal.
我可以告诉你，电话一直在响个不停，各国都想与这个政府、这位总统及其贸易团队进行交谈，试图达成协议。
And I can tell you the phones have been ringing off the hook, wanting to talk to this administration, this president, and his trade team to try to strike a deal.
And I can tell you the phones have been ringing off the hook, wanting to talk to this administration, this president, and his trade team to try to strike a deal.
It's because the world knows that they need the United States of America.
And it's because the world knows that they need the United States of America.
这是因为全世界都知道他们需要美国。
And it's because the world knows that they need the United States of America.
And it's because the world knows that they need the United States of America.
They need our market.
They need our markets.
他们需要我们的市场。
They need our market.
They need our markets.
They need our consumer.
They need our consumer.
他们需要我们的消费者。
They need our consumer.
They need our consumer.
The president has a lot of leverage on his side because he has the best economy and the best country in the world that he leads, and he knows that.
The president has a lot of leverage on his side because he has the best economy and the best country in the world that he leads, and he knows that.
总统在谈判中有很多筹码，因为他领导着世界上经济最好、最强大的国家，他知道这一点。
The president has a lot of leverage on his side because he has the best economy and the best country in the world that he leads, and he knows that.
The president has a lot of leverage on his side because he has the best economy and the best country in the world that he leads, and he knows that.
And it's about dang time we finally have a president who uses that economic leverage to benefit American workers.
And it's about dang time we finally have a president who uses that economic leverage to benefit American workers.
现在终于有一个总统能够利用这种经济优势为美国工人谋利了，这真是太好了。
And it's about dang time we finally have a president who uses that economic leverage to benefit American workers.
And it's about dang time we finally have a president who uses that economic leverage to benefit American workers.
And that's what the president is trying to do.
And that's what the president is trying to do.
这就是总统正在努力做的事情。
And that's what the president is trying to do.
And that's what the president is trying to do. Maggie.
马吉、
Maggie.
Caroline, thanks.
Caroline, thanks.
卡罗琳，谢谢你。
Caroline, thanks.
Caroline, thanks.
Does the president endorse something that Howard Lutnick said on television this weekend, which was that the army of millions and millions of human beings screwing in little screws to make iPhones, that kind of thing is going to be moving to the U.S.?
Does the president endorse something that Howard Ludwig said on television this weekend, which was that the army of millions and millions of human beings screwing in little screws to make iPhones, that kind of thing is going to be moving to the U.S.?
总统是否支持霍华德·卢格迪在本周末电视上所说的话，即数以百万计的人类劳动力正在拧紧螺丝制造 iPhone， 这种工作将转移到美国。
Does the president endorse something that Howard Lutnick said on television this weekend, which was that the army of millions and millions of human beings screwing in little screws to make iPhones, that kind of thing is going to be moving to the U.S.?
Does the president endorse something that Howard Ludwig said on television this weekend, which was that the army of millions and millions of human beings screwing in little screws to make iPhones, that kind of thing is going to be moving to the U.S.?
Is that how the president envisions manufacturing shifting?
Is that how the president envisions manufacturing shifting?
这就是总统设想的制造业转移方式吗？
Is that how the president envisions manufacturing shifting?
Is that how the president envisions manufacturing shifting?
And if so, how long would that take roughly?
And if so, how long would that take roughly?
如果是这样，那大约需要多长时间呢？
And if so, how long would that take roughly?
And if so, how long would that take roughly?
The president wants to increase manufacturing jobs here in the United States of America, but he's also looking at advanced technology.
The president wants to increase manufacturing jobs here in the United States of America, but he's also looking at advanced technologies.
总统希望在美国增加制造业工作岗位，但他也在关注先进技术。
The president wants to increase manufacturing jobs here in the United States of America, but he's also looking at advanced technology.
The president wants to increase manufacturing jobs here in the United States of America, but he's also looking at advanced technologies.
He's also looking at AI and emerging fields that are growing around the world that the United States needs to be a leader in as well.
He's also looking at AI and emerging fields that are growing around the world that the United States needs to be a leader in as well.
他还在关注人工智能和全球范围内正在兴起的美国需要成为领导者的新领域。
He's also looking at AI and emerging fields that are growing around the world that the United States needs to be a leader in as well.
He's also looking at AI and emerging fields that are growing around the world that the United States needs to be a leader in as well.
So there's an array of diverse jobs, more traditional manufacturing jobs as you discussed, but also jobs in advanced technology.
So there's an array of diverse jobs, more traditional manufacturing jobs as you discussed, but also jobs in advanced technologies.
所以有各种各样的不同工作，包括你讨论的传统制造业岗位，但也包括在先进科技领域的岗位。
So there's an array of diverse jobs, more traditional manufacturing jobs as you discussed, but also jobs in advanced technology.
So there's an array of diverse jobs, more traditional manufacturing jobs as you discussed, but also jobs in advanced technologies.
The president is looking at all of those.
The president is looking at all of those.
总统正在考虑所有这些方面。
The president is looking at all of those.
The president is looking at all of those.
He wants them to come back home.
He wants them to come back home.
他希望他们能回国。
He wants them to come back home.
He wants them to come back home.
But iPhones specifically, is that something that he thinks is the kind of technology that can move to the U.S.?
But iPhones specifically, is that something that he thinks is the kind of technology that can move to the U.S.?
但是 iPhone 这类产品，这是他认为可以转移到美国的技术吗？
But iPhones specifically, is that something that he thinks is the kind of technology that can move to the U.S.?
But iPhones specifically, is that something that he thinks is the kind of technology that can move to the U.S.?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
绝对的。
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
He believes we have the labor, we have the workforce, we have the resources to do it.
He believes we have the labor, we have the workforce, we have the resources to do it.
他相信我们有劳动力，有工作队伍，有资源来做这件事。
He believes we have the labor, we have the workforce, we have the resources to do it.
He believes we have the labor, we have the workforce, we have the resources to do it.
And as you know, Apple has invested $500 billion here in the United States.
And as you know, Apple has invested $500 billion here in the United States.
正如你所知，苹果在美国投资了5000亿美元。
And as you know, Apple has invested $500 billion here in the United States.
And as you know, Apple has invested $500 billion here in the United States.
So if Apple didn't think the United States could do it, they probably wouldn't have put up that big chunk of change.
So if Apple didn't think the United States could do it, they probably wouldn't have put up that big chunk of change.
所以，如果苹果认为美国无法做到这一点，他们可能就不会投入那么多资金。
So if Apple didn't think the United States could do it, they probably wouldn't have put up that big chunk of change.
So if Apple didn't think the United States could do it, they probably wouldn't have put up that big chunk of change. Elena.
伊莱娜。
Elena.
Hi, Kellen.
Hi, Kaylin.
嗨，凯伦。
Hi, Kellen.
Hi, Kaylin.
It's clear the president has gotten the world's attention with these tariffs.
It's clear the president has gotten the world's attention with these tariffs.
很明显，总统通过这些关税已经引起了全世界的注意。
It's clear the president has gotten the world's attention with these tariffs.
It's clear the president has gotten the world's attention with these tariffs.
Is he considering at all potentially holding off on imposing some of them before the deadline, or maybe later, reversing them because he's having these negotiations and having these good talks with other leaders?
Is he considering at all potentially holding off on imposing some of them before the deadline or maybe later, reversing them because he's having these negotiations and having these good talks with other leaders?
有没有？他是否在考虑在最后期限前暂停实施一些关税，或者也许之后，你知道的，撤销它们，因为他正在与其他领导人进行谈判，并且进行了很好的对话。
Is he considering at all potentially holding off on imposing some of them before the deadline, or maybe later, reversing them because he's having these negotiations and having these good talks with other leaders.
Is he considering at all potentially holding off on imposing some of them before the deadline or maybe later, reversing them because he's having these negotiations and having these good talks with other leaders?
The president was asked and answered this yesterday.
The president was asked and answered this yesterday.
总统昨天被问到并回答了这个问题。
The president was asked and answered this yesterday.
The president was asked and answered this yesterday.
He said he's not considering an extension or a delay.
He said he's not considering an extension or delay.
他说他没有考虑延期或推迟。
He said he's not considering an extension or a delay.
He said he's not considering an extension or delay.
I spoke to him before this briefing.
I spoke to him before this briefing.
我在这次简报之前和他谈过。
I spoke to him before this briefing.
I spoke to him before this briefing.
That was not his mindset.
That was not his mindset.
那不是他的想法。
That was not his mindset.
That was not his mindset.
He expects that these tariffs are going to go into effect.
He expects that these tariffs are going to go into effect.
他预计这些关税将会生效。
He expects that these tariffs are going to go into effect.
He expects that these tariffs are going to go into effect.
And you said something very important, Elena.
And you said something very important, Elena.
你说了一些非常重要的事情，伊莱娜。
And you said something very important, Elena.
And you said something very important, Elena.
In your question, you said the president has captivated the attention of the world.
In your question, you said the president has captivated the attention of the world.
在你的问题中，你说总统已经吸引了全世界的注意。
In your question, you said the president has captivated the attention of the world.
In your question, you said the president has captivated the attention of the world.
Absolutely he has.
Absolutely he has.
绝对的，他已经这样做了。
Absolutely he has.
Absolutely he has.
And it's about time we have a president in the Oval Office who is putting the world on notice and is putting the American people first and again is using the leverage of the United States to negotiate good trade deals.
And it's about time we have a president in the Oval Office who is putting the world on notice and is putting the American people first and, again, is using the leverage of the United States to negotiate good trade deals.
确实，我们终于有了一个在椭圆形办公室里向全世界发出警告，把美国人民放在首位，并再次利用美国的力量来谈判良好贸易协议的总统。
And it's about time we have a president in the Oval Office who is putting the world on notice and is putting the American people first and again is using the leverage of the United States to negotiate good trade deals.
And it's about time we have a president in the Oval Office who is putting the world on notice and is putting the American people first and, again, is using the leverage of the United States to negotiate good trade deals.
Just a quick follow-up.
Just a quick follow-up.
快速跟进一个问题。
Just a quick follow-up.
Just a quick follow-up. Sure.
当然可以。
Sure.
There's been some public sparring between Elon Musk and the president's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, on some of these tariffs.
There's been some public sparring between Elon Musk and the president's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, on some of these tariffs.
埃隆、马斯克和总统的贸易顾问彼得·纳瓦罗之间在一些关税问题上有一些公开的争论。
There's been some public sparring between Elon Musk and the president's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, on some of these tariffs.
There's been some public sparring between Elon Musk and the president's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, on some of these tariffs.
Musk actually referred to Navarro today as being, quote, dumber than a sack of bricks.
Musk actually referred to Navarro today as being, quote, dumber than a sack of bricks.
马斯克今天实际上称纳瓦罗为比一袋砖头还要笨。
Musk actually referred to Navarro today as being, quote, dumber than a sack of bricks.
Musk actually referred to Navarro today as being, quote, dumber than a sack of bricks.
Are you at all, or is the administration, the president, all concerned that this is maybe impacting the public's understanding of these tariffs?
Are you at all, or is the administration, the president at all concerned that this is maybe impacting the public's understanding of these tariffs?
你是否或者政府、总统是否担心这可能影响公众对这些关税的理解？
Are you at all, or is the administration, the president, all concerned that this is maybe impacting the public's understanding of these tariffs?
Are you at all, or is the administration, the president at all concerned that this is maybe impacting the public's understanding of these tariffs?
It might be messing with the message on it.
It might be messing with the message on it.
它可能会影响这个信息吗？
It might be messing with the message on it.
It might be messing with the message on it.
No.
No.
不，
No.
No.
Look, these are obviously two individuals who have very different views on trade and on tariffs.
Look, these are obviously two individuals who have very different views on trade and on tariffs.
看，很明显，这两个人在贸易和关税问题上有着截然不同的观点。
Look, these are obviously two individuals who have very different views on trade and on tariffs.
Look, these are obviously two individuals who have very different views on trade and on tariffs.
Boys will be boys, and we will let their public sparring continue.
Boys will be boys, and we will let their public sparring continue.
男孩就是男孩，我们会让他们的公开争论继续下去。
Boys will be boys, and we will let their public sparring continue.
Boys will be boys, and we will let their public sparring continue.
And you guys should all be very grateful that we have the most transparent administration in history.
And you guys should all be very grateful that we have the most transparent administration in history.
你们都应该非常感谢我们有史上最透明的政府。
And you guys should all be very grateful that we have the most transparent administration in history.
And you guys should all be very grateful that we have the most transparent administration in history.
And I think it also speaks to the president's willingness to hear from all sides, that he has people at the highest levels of this government in this White House who have very diverse opinions on very diverse issues.
And I think it also speaks to the president's willingness to hear from all sides, that he has people at the highest levels of this government in this White House who have very diverse opinions on very diverse issues.
我认为这也反映了总统愿意听取各方意见，他在这个政府、白宫里有来自不同背景的人，对各种问题有着不同的看法。
And I think it also speaks to the president's willingness to hear from all sides, that he has people at the highest levels of this government in this White House who have very diverse opinions on very diverse issues.
And I think it also speaks to the president's willingness to hear from all sides, that he has people at the highest levels of this government in this White House who have very diverse opinions on very diverse issues.
But the president takes all opinions in mind, and then he makes the best decision based on the best interests of the American public.
But the president takes all opinions in mind, and then he makes the best decision based on the best interests of the American public.
但总统会考虑所有人的意见，然后根据美国公众的最佳利益做出最佳决定。
But the president takes all opinions in mind, and then he makes the best decision based on the best interests of the American public.
But the president takes all opinions in mind, and then he makes the best decision based on the best interests of the American public. Deanna.
戴安娜，
Deanna.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline.
谢谢，卡罗琳。
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline.
On Truth Social today, Trump was talking about one-stop shopping talks with foreign leaders, bringing leaders to the U.S., to Washington, and talking to them about tariffs, but also other topics.
On Truth Social today, Trump was talking about one-stop shopping talks with foreign leaders, bringing leaders to the U.S., to Washington, and talking to them about tariffs, but also other topics.
今天在真相社交网上，特朗普正在与外国领导人进行一站式会谈。你知道，把领导人带到美国、华盛顿，和他们讨论关税问题，但还有其他话题。
On Truth Social today, Trump was talking about one-stop shopping talks with foreign leaders, bringing leaders to the U.S., to Washington, and talking to them about tariffs, but also other topics.
On Truth Social today, Trump was talking about one-stop shopping talks with foreign leaders, bringing leaders to the U.S., to Washington, and talking to them about tariffs, but also other topics.
So is that part of his strategy to bring the leaders to Washington and trying to get deals, outside of tariffs on foreign policy issues as well?
So is that part of his strategy to bring the leaders to Washington and trying to get deals, outside of tariffs on foreign policy issues as well?
所以这是他的一部分策略吗？把领导人带到华盛顿，并试图在外交政策问题上达成协议，不仅仅是关税方面。
So is that part of his strategy to bring the leaders to Washington and trying to get deals, outside of tariffs on foreign policy issues as well?
So is that part of his strategy to bring the leaders to Washington and trying to get deals, outside of tariffs on foreign policy issues as well?
I think the president, again, is going to have a custom, tailor-made approach to each and every country.
I think the president, again, is going to have a custom, tailor-made approach to each and every country.
我认为总统会针对每一个国家制定个性化的、量身定做的策略。
I think the president, again, is going to have a custom, tailor-made approach to each and every country.
I think the president, again, is going to have a custom, tailor-made approach to each and every country.
And if that means discussions of foreign aid, of our military presence in these countries, how those troops are paid for, come to the table, that could be part of the negotiation in these economic negotiations.
And if that means discussions of foreign aid, of our military presence in these countries, how those troops are paid for, come to the table, that could be part of the negotiation in these economic negotiations.
如果这意味着讨论外国援助，我们在这个国家的军事存在，这些部队的支付方式如何进入谈判桌，这可能是经济谈判中的协商内容之一。
And if that means discussions of foreign aid, of our military presence in these countries, how those troops are paid for, come to the table, that could be part of the negotiation in these economic negotiations.
And if that means discussions of foreign aid, of our military presence in these countries, how those troops are paid for, come to the table, that could be part of the negotiation in these economic negotiations.
But it's the president's economic team who will be leading these.
But it's the president's economic team who will be leading these.
但领导这些经济谈判的是总统的经济团队。
But it's the president's economic team who will be leading these.
But it's the president's economic team who will be leading these.
These are tariff and trade negotiations.
These are tariff and trade negotiations.
这些都是关税和贸易谈判。
These are tariff and trade negotiations.
These are tariff and trade negotiations.
And yes, they will be one-stop shopping for each and every country.
And yes, they will be one-stop shopping for each and every country.
是的，他们会为每一个国家提供一站式服务。
And yes, they will be one-stop shopping for each and every country.
And yes, they will be one-stop shopping for each and every country.
They will be, as the president said again, tailor-made, not off the rack, to each and every country based on America's needs.
They will be, as the president said again, tailor-made, not off the rack, to each and every country based on America's needs.
正如总统再次所说，这些将根据每个国家的需求量身定制，并非通用模板，以满足美国的需要。
They will be, as the president said again, tailor-made, not off the rack, to each and every country based on America's needs.
They will be, as the president said again, tailor-made, not off the rack, to each and every country based on America's needs. And can you confirm?
你能确认吗？
And can you confirm? Good.
好的。
Good.
So President Trump has designated Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization and supported its members while also moving to restrict Venezuela's oil exports.
So, President Trump has designated Trinidad and Tobago as a foreign terrorist organization and deported its members, while also moving to restrict Venezuela's oil exports.
所以，特朗普总统已经将特立尼达和多巴哥指定为外国恐怖组织，并驱逐了其成员，同时也在限制委内瑞拉的石油出口。
So President Trump has designated Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization and supported its members while also moving to restrict Venezuela's oil exports.
So, President Trump has designated Trinidad and Tobago as a foreign terrorist organization and deported its members, while also moving to restrict Venezuela's oil exports.
Is the administration preparing additional military or economic actions against Venezuela and the Maduro regime?
Is the administration preparing additional military or economic actions against Venezuela and the Maduro regime?
政府是否正在准备对委内瑞拉及其马杜罗政权采取更多的军事或经济行动？
Is the administration preparing additional military or economic actions against Venezuela and the Maduro regime?
Is the administration preparing additional military or economic actions against Venezuela and the Maduro regime?
And my second question is about Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett.
And my second question is about Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett.
我的第二个问题是关于最高法院大法官艾米·康尼·巴雷特。
And my second question is about Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett.
And my second question is about Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett.
Is the administration have a comment on her decision to go with the liberals and go actually with the Tren de Aragua?
Does the administration have a comment on her decision to go with the liberals and go, actually, with the Trinidad Araguas?
政府对他的决定与自由派一起去，实际上支持特立尼达和多巴哥有何评论？
Is the administration have a comment on her decision to go with the liberals and go actually with the Tren de Aragua?
Does the administration have a comment on her decision to go with the liberals and go, actually, with the Trinidad Araguas?
This is the same justice that actually sided against January 6th hostages last year.
This is the same justice that actually sided against January 6th hostages last year.
这正是去年站在1月6日人质一边的那位大法官。
This is the same justice that actually sided against January 6th hostages last year.
This is the same justice that actually sided against January 6th hostages last year.
So is the administration have a comment?
So, does the administration have a comment?
所以，政府对此有何评论？
So is the administration have a comment?
So, does the administration have a comment?
Are they disappointed in Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett?
Are they disappointed in Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett?
他们对最高法院大法官艾米·康尼·巴雷特感到失望吗？
Are they disappointed in Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett?
Are they disappointed in Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett?
To your first question, I don't have any actions to read out in terms of Venezuela.
To your first question, I don't have any actions to read out in terms of Venezuela.
关于你的第一个问题，就委内瑞拉而言，我没有要宣布的行动。
To your first question, I don't have any actions to read out in terms of Venezuela.
To your first question, I don't have any actions to read out in terms of Venezuela.
The president has imposed secondary tariffs on the Maduro regime and on Venezuela in the form of oil, which is obviously going to have a crippling effect on the Maduro regime, and that's the intended effect of this administration.
The president has imposed secondary tariffs on the Maduro regime and on Venezuela in the form of oil, which is obviously going to have a crippling effect on the Maduro regime, and that's the intended effect of this administration.
总统已经对马杜罗政权和委内瑞拉以石油的形式实施了2级关税，这显然会对马杜罗政权产生毁灭性的影响，而这正是政府的意图。
The president has imposed secondary tariffs on the Maduro regime and on Venezuela in the form of oil, which is obviously going to have a crippling effect on the Maduro regime, and that's the intended effect of this administration.
The president has imposed secondary tariffs on the Maduro regime and on Venezuela in the form of oil, which is obviously going to have a crippling effect on the Maduro regime, and that's the intended effect of this administration.
As for the justice you mentioned, as for the Supreme Court, we've made our feelings very clear.
As for the justice you mentioned, as for the Supreme Court, we've made our feelings very clear.
至于你提到的大法官，关于最高法院，我们的立场已经非常明确。
As for the justice you mentioned, as for the Supreme Court, we've made our feelings very clear.
As for the justice you mentioned, as for the Supreme Court, we've made our feelings very clear.
We believe this was a massive victory.
We believe this was a massive victory.
我们认为这是一个巨大的胜利。
We believe this was a massive victory.
We believe this was a massive victory.
Certainly, we wish this was a 9-0 decision because we firmly believe that the president was well within his constitutional authority.
Certainly, we wish this was a 9-0 decision because we firmly believe that the president was well within his constitutional authority.
当然，我们希望这是9-0的判决，因为我们坚信总统完全在宪法授权范围内行事。
Certainly, we wish this was a 9-0 decision because we firmly believe that the president was well within his constitutional authority.
Certainly, we wish this was a 9-0 decision because we firmly believe that the president was well within his constitutional authority.
And the Supreme Court made that very clear last night, and they put Judge Boasberg in his place.
And the Supreme Court made that very clear last night, and they put Judge Boasberg in his place.
最高法院昨晚已经非常清楚地表明了这一点，并让博尔斯伯格法官回到了他的位置上。
And the Supreme Court made that very clear last night, and they put Judge Boasberg in his place.
And the Supreme Court made that very clear last night, and they put Judge Boasberg in his place.
We called on the Supreme Court to rein in these judges who are acting as judicial activists, not real arbiters of the truth and the law.
We called on the Supreme Court to rein in these judges who are acting as judicial activists, not real arbiters of the truth and the law.
我们呼吁最高法院对这些充当司法激进分子的法官进行约束，而不是真正的事实和法律仲裁者。
We called on the Supreme Court to rein in these judges who are acting as judicial activists, not real arbiters of the truth and the law.
We called on the Supreme Court to rein in these judges who are acting as judicial activists, not real arbiters of the truth and the law.
And that's exactly what we saw the Supreme Court do yesterday.
And that's exactly what we saw the Supreme Court do yesterday.
而这正是我们在昨天看到最高法院所做的事情。
And that's exactly what we saw the Supreme Court do yesterday.
And that's exactly what we saw the Supreme Court do yesterday.
Christian.
基督教徒。 Christian.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline.
谢谢，卡罗琳。
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline.
Now that the president's reciprocal tariffs are here, going into effect tomorrow, what's the status of the ERS?
Now that the president's reciprocal tariffs are here going into effect tomorrow, what's the status of the ERS?
现在总统的对等关税将于明天生效 ，ERS 的状态如何？
Now that the president's reciprocal tariffs are here, going into effect tomorrow, what's the status of the ERS?
Now that the president's reciprocal tariffs are here going into effect tomorrow, what's the status of the ERS?
When will they actually start collecting revenue?
When will they actually start collecting revenue?
他们何时开始征税？
When will they actually start collecting revenue?
When will they actually start collecting revenue?
And will that be nested under CBP or somewhere else entirely?
And will that be nested under CBP or somewhere else entirely?
这是否会被嵌入到海关和边境保护局 CBP 之下，或者完全在其他地方？
And will that be nested under CBP or somewhere else entirely?
And will that be nested under CBP or somewhere else entirely?
It's something Secretary Lutnick has taken up, so I defer you to the Department of Commerce.
It's something Secretary Lutnick has taken up, so I defer you to the Department of Commerce.
这是路特尼克部长正在处理的问题，所以我将您转给商务部。
It's something Secretary Lutnick has taken up, so I defer you to the Department of Commerce.
It's something Secretary Lutnick has taken up, so I defer you to the Department of Commerce.
But it's something that he and the president believe quite strongly in, and it's a promise that they intend to keep to the American.
But it's something that he and the president believe quite strongly in, and it's a promise that they intend to keep to the American people.
但这正是总统和路特尼克部长非常坚信的事情，这也是他们打算对美国人民履行的承诺。
But it's something that he and the president believe quite strongly in, and it's a promise that they intend to keep to the American.
But it's something that he and the president believe quite strongly in, and it's a promise that they intend to keep to the American people.
Wait, can you explain why the president opted to send Secretary Hegseth to the dignified transfer last week instead of attending himself?
Can you explain why the president opted to send Secretary Hegseth to the dignified transfer last week instead of attending himself?
你能解释一下为什么总统选择让赫格塞斯国务卿参加上周的庄严交接仪式，而不是亲自出席吗？
Wait, can you explain why the president opted to send Secretary Hegseth to the dignified transfer last week instead of attending himself?
Can you explain why the president opted to send Secretary Hegseth to the dignified transfer last week instead of attending himself? Sure.
当然，
Sure.
Secretary Hegseth was there to represent the administration.
Secretary Hegseth was there to represent the administration.
赫格塞斯国务卿在那里代表政府。
Secretary Hegseth was there to represent the administration.
Secretary Hegseth was there to represent the administration.
The president has expressed his condolences to these families, as have I from this podium.
The president has expressed his condolences to these families, as have I from this podium.
总统和我都在这个讲台向这些家庭表示哀悼。
The president has expressed his condolences to these families, as have I from this podium.
The president has expressed his condolences to these families, as have I from this podium. Shelby.
谢尔比，
Shelby.
The president's trade representative this morning told senators that the president does not intend on carving out exemptions for products and companies when it comes to tariffs.
The president's trade representative this morning told senators that the president does not intend on carving out exemptions for products and companies when it comes to tariffs.
总统贸易代表今天早上告诉参议员，总统无意在关税问题上为产品和公司开豁免口子。
The president's trade representative this morning told senators that the president does not intend on carving out exemptions for products and companies when it comes to tariffs.
The president's trade representative this morning told senators that the president does not intend on carving out exemptions for products and companies when it comes to tariffs.
But would the administration consider changing that stance should bankruptcies begin among U.S. companies who are dependent on China trade?
But would the administration consider changing that stance should bankruptcies begin among U.S. companies who are dependent on China trade?
但如果美国依赖与中国贸易的公司开始出现破产情况，政府是否会考虑改变这一立场呢？
But would the administration consider changing that stance should bankruptcies begin among U.S. companies who are dependent on China trade?
But would the administration consider changing that stance should bankruptcies begin among U.S. companies who are dependent on China trade?
I won't get ahead of the president on any exemptions or his decision on that.
I won't get ahead of the president on any exemptions or his decision on that.
我不会在豁免或总统对此的决定上抢跑。
I won't get ahead of the president on any exemptions or his decision on that.
I won't get ahead of the president on any exemptions or his decision on that.
I will leave that to him.
I will leave that to him.
这留给他来处理。
I will leave that to him.
I will leave that to him.
Again, we're looking at this country by country and based on the needs of the American people and the American workforce.
But again, we're looking at this country by country and based on the needs of the American people and the American workforce.
但再次强调，我们是根据美国人民和美国劳动力的需求，国家对国家的进行考量的。
But again, we're looking at this country by country and based on the needs of the American people and the American workforce.
But again, we're looking at this country by country and based on the needs of the American people and the American workforce.
And one more.
And one more.
还有一件事。
And one more.
And one more.
Can you walk us through how this specific tariff plan was decided on and which advisor came up with it?
Can you walk us through how this specific tariff plan was decided on and which advisor came up with it?
你能给我们解释一下这个具体的关税计划是如何决定的，以及是谁提出的吗？
Can you walk us through how this specific tariff plan was decided on and which advisor came up with it?
Can you walk us through how this specific tariff plan was decided on and which advisor came up with it?
The reciprocal tariff plan?
The reciprocal tariff plan?
相互对等的关税计划。
The reciprocal tariff plan?
The reciprocal tariff plan?
It was a plan that was discussed by the president's entire trade team over the course of many, many meetings, and the president ultimately decided on which way to go.
It was a plan that was discussed by the president's entire trade team over the course of many, many meetings, and the president ultimately decided on which way to go.
这是一个由总统整个贸易团队在多次会议中讨论过的计划，最终由总统决定采取何种方式。
It was a plan that was discussed by the president's entire trade team over the course of many, many meetings, and the president ultimately decided on which way to go.
It was a plan that was discussed by the president's entire trade team over the course of many, many meetings, and the president ultimately decided on which way to go.
A few proposals were given to the president.
A few proposals were given to the president.
向总统提出了一些提案。
A few proposals were given to the president.
A few proposals were given to the president.
There was debate and discussion, and the president made his decision.
There was debate and discussion, and the president made his decision.
有辩论和讨论，然后总统做出了他的决定。
There was debate and discussion, and the president made his decision.
There was debate and discussion, and the president made his decision.
And as you've seen very publicly, the entire trade team is on board with this plan and the negotiations that will ensue because of it.
And as you've seen very publicly, the entire trade team is on board with this plan and the negotiations that will ensue because of it.
正如你们所见，整个贸易团队都支持这个计划以及随之而来的谈判。
And as you've seen very publicly, the entire trade team is on board with this plan and the negotiations that will ensue because of it.
And as you've seen very publicly, the entire trade team is on board with this plan and the negotiations that will ensue because of it.
Sure.
Sure.
当然。
Sure.
Sure.
Caroline, on Iran, and given what's going to be happening on Saturday, what exactly is the current administration doing to stop Iran's funding of terrorist aggression worldwide that the previous administration wasn't doing?
On Iran, given what's going to be happening on Saturday, what exactly is the current administration doing to stop Iran's funding of terrorist aggression worldwide that the previous administration wasn't doing?
关于伊朗，考虑到周六将要发生的事情，请问现任政府正在采取什么措施来阻止伊朗资助全球恐怖主义活动，而上届政府却没有这样做？
Caroline, on Iran, and given what's going to be happening on Saturday, what exactly is the current administration doing to stop Iran's funding of terrorist aggression worldwide that the previous administration wasn't doing?
On Iran, given what's going to be happening on Saturday, what exactly is the current administration doing to stop Iran's funding of terrorist aggression worldwide that the previous administration wasn't doing?
Well, first of all, when it comes to Saturday, I won't get ahead of the president.
Well, first of all, when it comes to Saturday, I won't get ahead of the president.
首先，在周六的问题上，我不会提前预判总统。
Well, first of all, when it comes to Saturday, I won't get ahead of the president.
Well, first of all, when it comes to Saturday, I won't get ahead of the president.
He has said there will be direct talks with Iran on Saturday.
He has said there will be direct talks with Iran on Saturday.
他已表示将在周六与伊朗进行直接对话。
He has said there will be direct talks with Iran on Saturday.
He has said there will be direct talks with Iran on Saturday.
I won't further any details from this podium for obvious reasons, security reasons.
I won't further any details from this podium for obvious reasons, security reasons.
出于明显的原因，安全原因，我不会从这个讲台进一步透露任何细节。
I won't further any details from this podium for obvious reasons, security reasons.
I won't further any details from this podium for obvious reasons, security reasons.
It will, provide an update as we always have.
It will, provide an update as we always have.
它将提供更新，正如我们一直做的那样。
It will, provide an update as we always have.
It will, provide an update as we always have.
However, when it comes to Iran, the president has reimposed crippling sanctions on the Iranian regime, and he's made it very clear to Iran they have a choice to make.
However, when it comes to Iran, the president has reimposed crippling sanctions on the Iranian regime, and he's made it very clear to Iran they have a choice to make.
然而，在伊朗问题上，总统已经对伊朗政权实施了致命制裁，并明确告诉伊朗他们必须做出选择。
However, when it comes to Iran, the president has reimposed crippling sanctions on the Iranian regime, and he's made it very clear to Iran they have a choice to make.
However, when it comes to Iran, the president has reimposed crippling sanctions on the Iranian regime, and he's made it very clear to Iran they have a choice to make.
You can strike a deal with the president, you can negotiate, or there will be hell to pay.
You can strike a deal with the president, you can negotiate, or there will be hell to pay.
你可以与总统达成协议，可以进行谈判，否则将付出惨重代价。
You can strike a deal with the president, you can negotiate, or there will be hell to pay.
You can strike a deal with the president, you can negotiate, or there will be hell to pay.
As the president said yesterday, if they don't choose to move forward with diplomacy and a deal, which is the direction we do see them headed in, there will be grave consequences to pay.
And as the president said yesterday, if they don't choose to move forward with diplomacy and a deal, which is the direction we do see them headed in, there will be grave consequences to bear.
正如总统昨天所说，如果他们不选择通过外交和协议前进，这是我们可以预见的方向，那么将承担严重后果。
As the president said yesterday, if they don't choose to move forward with diplomacy and a deal, which is the direction we do see them headed in, there will be grave consequences to pay.
And as the president said yesterday, if they don't choose to move forward with diplomacy and a deal, which is the direction we do see them headed in, there will be grave consequences to bear.
To the back row.
To the back row.
给后面一排。
To the back row.
To the back row.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
请说。
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Thanks, Caroline.
谢谢，卡罗琳。
Thanks, Caroline.
On the president's threat yesterday on social media to increase tariffs against China by an additional 50% in response to their retaliation, has he signed anything in terms of an executive order, any documentation around that?
On the president's threat yesterday on social media to increase tariffs against China by an additional 50% in response to their retaliation, has he signed anything in terms of an executive order or any documentation around that?
关于总统昨天在社交媒体上威胁，如果中国报复，将对华加征额外50%的关税，他是否签署了任何行政命令或相关文件？
On the president's threat yesterday on social media to increase tariffs against China by an additional 50% in response to their retaliation, has he signed anything in terms of an executive order, any documentation around that?
On the president's threat yesterday on social media to increase tariffs against China by an additional 50% in response to their retaliation, has he signed anything in terms of an executive order or any documentation around that?
Will that additional 50% go into effect tomorrow?
Will that additional 50% go into effect tomorrow?
那额外50%的关税明天会生效吗？
Will that additional 50% go into effect tomorrow?
Will that additional 50% go into effect tomorrow?
They will be going into effect at 12:01 a.m.
They will be going into effect at 12:01 a.m.
将在凌晨12点01分开始实施。
They will be going into effect at 12:01 a.m.
They will be going into effect at 12:01 a.m.
tonight, so effectively tomorrow.
Tonight, so effectively tomorrow.
今晚，也就是实际上明天。
Tonight, so effectively tomorrow.
Tonight, so effectively tomorrow.
Yes.
Yes.
是的，
Yes.
Yes.
Work on that today?
Is he going to work on that today?
他今天会处理这件事吗？
Work on that today?
Is he going to work on that today?
Of course, as always.
Of course, as always.
当然，总是这样。
Of course, as always.
Of course, as always.
To the gentleman in front of you, because that's who I originally called on.
To the gentleman in front of you, because that's who I originally called on.
给前面的这位先生，因为他就是我最初点名的人。
To the gentleman in front of you, because that's who I originally called on.
To the gentleman in front of you, because that's who I originally called on.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
请说。
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Over the weekend, President Trump said that he would be willing to have U.S. citizens deported to El Salvador with the cooperation of President Bukele.
Over the weekend, President Trump said that he would be willing to have U.S. citizens deported to El Salvador with the cooperation of President Bukele.
上周末，特朗普总统表示，他愿意与布克勒总统合作，将美国公民遣返回萨尔瓦多。
Over the weekend, President Trump said that he would be willing to have U.S. citizens deported to El Salvador with the cooperation of President Bukele.
Over the weekend, President Trump said that he would be willing to have U.S. citizens deported to El Salvador with the cooperation of President Bukele.
How would that work legally, and how many people would potentially be available for that operation?
How would that work legally, and how many people would potentially be available for that operation?
这在法律上如何运作，又有多少人可能参与这项行动？
How would that work legally, and how many people would potentially be available for that operation?
How would that work legally, and how many people would potentially be available for that operation?
So the president has discussed this idea quite a few times publicly.
So the president has discussed this idea quite a few times publicly.
总统已经多次公开讨论过这个想法。
So the president has discussed this idea quite a few times publicly.
So the president has discussed this idea quite a few times publicly.
He's also discussed it privately.
He's also discussed it privately.
他也私下里讨论过这件事。
He's also discussed it privately.
He's also discussed it privately.
You're referring to the president's idea for American citizens to potentially be deported.
You're referring to the president's idea for American citizens to potentially be deported.
你指的是总统关于可能遣返美国公民的想法。
You're referring to the president's idea for American citizens to potentially be deported.
You're referring to the president's idea for American citizens to potentially be deported.
These would be heinous, violent criminals who have broken our nation's laws repeatedly.
These would be heinous, violent criminals who have broken our nation's laws repeatedly.
这些人是极其暴力的罪犯，他们一再违反了我们国家的法律。
These would be heinous, violent criminals who have broken our nation's laws repeatedly.
These would be heinous, violent criminals who have broken our nation's laws repeatedly.
And these are violent repeat offenders in American streets.
And these are violent repeat offenders in American streets.
这些是在美国街头反复犯罪的暴力分子。
And these are violent repeat offenders in American streets.
And these are violent repeat offenders in American streets.
The president has said, if it's legal, right, if there is a legal pathway to do that.
The president has said, if it's legal, right, if there is a legal pathway to do that.
总统说，如果这在法律上是允许的、正确的，如果有合法途径可以这样做的话。
The president has said, if it's legal, right, if there is a legal pathway to do that.
The president has said, if it's legal, right, if there is a legal pathway to do that.
He's not sure.
He's not sure.
他不确定。
He's not sure.
He's not sure.
We are not sure if there is.
We are not sure if there is.
我们也不确定是否存在这样的法律途径。
We are not sure if there is.
We are not sure if there is.
It's an idea that he has simply floated and has discussed very publicly as in the effort of transparency.
It's an idea that he has simply floated and has discussed very publicly in the effort of transparency.
这是一个他只是提出并非常公开的讨论过的想法，目的是为了透明度。
It's an idea that he has simply floated and has discussed very publicly as in the effort of transparency.
It's an idea that he has simply floated and has discussed very publicly in the effort of transparency.
Reagan.
Reagan.
里根。
Reagan.
Reagan.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline.
谢谢你，卡罗琳。
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline.
There's been more reporting coming out now about President Biden's decline while in the White House.
There's been more reporting coming out now about President Biden's decline while in the White House.
现在有关拜登总统在白宫期间状况恶化的报道越来越多了。
There's been more reporting coming out now about President Biden's decline while in the White House.
There's been more reporting coming out now about President Biden's decline while in the White House.
Is the White House considering releasing the audio of Biden's interview with Special Counsel Robert Hur to the public, which the former president had previously blocked?
Is the White House considering releasing the audio of Biden's interview with Special Counsel Rafferty to the public, which the former president had previously blocked?
白宫是否正在考虑公开发布拜登总统接受特别顾问拉弗蒂采访的音频？这是之前前总统曾阻止发布的。
Is the White House considering releasing the audio of Biden's interview with Special Counsel Robert Hur to the public, which the former president had previously blocked?
Is the White House considering releasing the audio of Biden's interview with Special Counsel Rafferty to the public, which the former president had previously blocked?
I don't have an update on that, but I can certainly check.
I don't have an update on that, but I can certainly check.
我目前没有这方面的更新信息，但我可以去查一下。
I don't have an update on that, but I can certainly check.
I don't have an update on that, but I can certainly check.
I think the American people would be quite interested to hear that tape, but I'll double check on the release of it.
I think the American people would be quite interested to hear that tape, but I'll double check on the release of it.
我认为美国人民会非常感兴趣听那盘录音带的内容，但我会再确认一下是否要发布这盘录音带。
I think the American people would be quite interested to hear that tape, but I'll double check on the release of it.
I think the American people would be quite interested to hear that tape, but I'll double check on the release of it. Thank you.
谢谢你。
Thank you.
Michael.
Michael.
迈克尔。
Michael.
Michael.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline.
谢谢你，卡罗琳。
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline.
On Saturday, during meetings with Iran, President Trump says high-level officials will be meeting directly with Iranian officials.
On Saturday, during meetings with Iran, President Trump says high-level officials will be meeting directly with Iranian officials.
周六，在与伊朗的会谈中，特朗普总统表示，高级官员将直接与伊朗官员会面。
On Saturday, during meetings with Iran, President Trump says high-level officials will be meeting directly with Iranian officials.
On Saturday, during meetings with Iran, President Trump says high-level officials will be meeting directly with Iranian officials.
We're hearing some pushback from Iran now saying those talks will be indirect.
We're hearing some pushback from Iran now saying those talks will be indirect.
我们现在听到伊朗方面的一些反对意见，称这些会谈将是间接进行的。
We're hearing some pushback from Iran now saying those talks will be indirect.
We're hearing some pushback from Iran now saying those talks will be indirect.
Can you clarify?
Can you clarify?
你能澄清一下吗？
Can you clarify?
Can you clarify?
They will be direct talks on Saturday, and I won't get ahead of the president on any further details.
They will be direct talks on Saturday, and I won't get ahead of the president on any further details.
周六将会有直接对话，我不会提前透露任何进一步的细节。
They will be direct talks on Saturday, and I won't get ahead of the president on any further details.
They will be direct talks on Saturday, and I won't get ahead of the president on any further details. Jennifer.
詹妮弗。
Jennifer.
Two things.
Yeah, two things.
有两件事。
Two things.
Yeah, two things.
On the Israel tariffs, can you give us an update on the discussion on relaxing those tariffs?
On the Israel tariffs, can you give us an update on the discussion on relaxing those tariffs?
关于以色列关税的问题，你能给我们更新一下放松这些关税的讨论情况吗？
On the Israel tariffs, can you give us an update on the discussion on relaxing those tariffs?
On the Israel tariffs, can you give us an update on the discussion on relaxing those tariffs?
And then I had another question about the Doge team after that.
And then I had another question about the Doge team after that.
然后我还有一个问题，关于政府效率部之后的事情。
And then I had another question about the Doge team after that.
And then I had another question about the Doge team after that.
That discussion is ongoing.
That discussion is ongoing.
那场讨论正在进行中。
That discussion is ongoing.
That discussion is ongoing.
I don't have any definitive details to iron out for you here.
I don't have any definitive details to iron out for you here.
在这里，我没有确切的细节可以给你敲定。
I don't have any definitive details to iron out for you here.
I don't have any definitive details to iron out for you here.
And then the president on Thursday told us that there was an incredible discovery that the Doge team had made.
And then the president on Thursday told us that there was an incredible discovery that the Doge team had made.
然后，周四总统告诉我们有一个惊人的发现，政府效率部已经做出了这个发现。
And then the president on Thursday told us that there was an incredible discovery that the Doge team had made.
And then the president on Thursday told us that there was an incredible discovery that the Doge team had made.
He called it horrible and incredible.
He called it horrible and incredible.
他称之为可怕而惊人。
He called it horrible and incredible.
He called it horrible and incredible.
Can you reveal that yet?
Can you reveal that yet?
你能透露一下吗？
Can you reveal that yet?
Can you reveal that yet?
Give us details on what it was about.
Give us details on what it was about.
能给我们一些关于它的细节吗？
Give us details on what it was about.
Give us details on what it was about.
There has been a discovery.
There has been a discovery.
确实有一个发现。
There has been a discovery.
There has been a discovery.
I hate to leave you hanging on a cliff, but I don't want to get ahead of the president on that.
I hate to leave you hanging on a cliff, but I don't want to get ahead of the president on that.
我也不想让你悬在半空中，但是我不希望在我前面总统。
I hate to leave you hanging on a cliff, but I don't want to get ahead of the president on that.
I hate to leave you hanging on a cliff, but I don't want to get ahead of the president on that.
But I can confirm there has been a discovery.
But I can confirm there has been a discovery.
但我可以确认，确实有一个发现。
But I can't confirm there has been a discovery.
But I can confirm there has been a discovery.
Just not quite yet ready for release.
It's just not quite yet ready for release.
只是现在还没有准备好发布。
Just not quite yet ready for release.
It's just not quite yet ready for release. Sure.
当然。
Sure.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
继续吧。
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Caroline, thank you.
Caroline, thank you.
卡罗琳，谢谢你。
Caroline, thank you.
Caroline, thank you.
I was calling on the young lady behind you, but I'll come to you after, Ed.
I was calling on the young lady behind you, but I'll come to you after, Ed.
我是在叫你身后那位女士，不过埃德，等一下我会来问你的。
I was calling on the young lady behind you, but I'll come to you after, Ed.
I was calling on the young lady behind you, but I'll come to you after, Ed.
Not discriminating here.
Not discriminating here.
这里没有歧视。
Not discriminating here.
Not discriminating here.
The president is meeting today with House Republicans.
The president is meeting today with House Republicans.
总统今天正在与众议院共和党人会面。
The president is meeting today with House Republicans.
The president is meeting today with House Republicans.
Can you say who is in that meeting and his message to Republicans that are skeptical of the Senate-passed budget framework?
Can you say who is in that meeting and his message to Republicans that are skeptical of the Senate-passed budget framework?
你能说一下在那个会议上都有谁，以及他对众议院中对参议院通过的预算框架持怀疑态度的共和党人的信息是什么吗？
Can you say who is in that meeting and his message to Republicans that are skeptical of the Senate-passed budget framework?
Can you say who is in that meeting and his message to Republicans that are skeptical of the Senate-passed budget framework?
Sure.
Sure.
当然。
Sure.
Sure.
The president will be meeting with Republican lawmakers today here at the White House to talk to them about the framework that the Senate passed.
The president will be meeting with Republican lawmakers today here at the White House to talk to them about the framework that the Senate passed.
总统今天将在白宫与共和党议员会面，讨论参议院通过的框架。
The president will be meeting with Republican lawmakers today here at the White House to talk to them about the framework that the Senate passed.
The president will be meeting with Republican lawmakers today here at the White House to talk to them about the framework that the Senate passed.
The president was very quick to put out a statement about his support for the reconciliation package that the Senate passed, and he is counting on House Republicans to pass it.
The president was very quick to put out a statement about his support for the reconciliation package that the Senate passed, and he is counting on House Republicans to pass it.
总统很快就发表了一份声明，支持参议院通过的调和方案，并指望众议院共和党人能够通过它。
The president was very quick to put out a statement about his support for the reconciliation package that the Senate passed, and he is counting on House Republicans to pass it.
The president was very quick to put out a statement about his support for the reconciliation package that the Senate passed, and he is counting on House Republicans to pass it.
The Republicans received an overwhelming mandate from the American public to govern.
The Republicans received an overwhelming mandate from the American public to govern.
共和党从美国公众那里获得了压倒性的执政授权。
The Republicans received an overwhelming mandate from the American public to govern.
The Republicans received an overwhelming mandate from the American public to govern.
We have an extraordinary opportunity.
We have an extraordinary opportunity.
我们有一个非凡的机会。
We have an extraordinary opportunity.
We have an extraordinary opportunity.
There are key promises that the president made to the American people in this bill.
There are key promises that the president made to the American people in this bill.
总统在这项法案中对美国人做出了关键承诺。
There are key promises that the president made to the American people in this bill.
There are key promises that the president made to the American people in this bill.
Tax cuts, securing the border, deregulation, unleashing the might of American energy.
Tax cuts, securing the border, deregulation, unleashing the might of American energy.
减税，确保边境安全，解除管制，释放美国能源的力量。
Tax cuts, securing the border, deregulation, unleashing the might of American energy.
Tax cuts, securing the border, deregulation, unleashing the might of American energy.
These are good things for the American people.
These are good things for the American people.
这些都是对美国人好的事情。
These are good things for the American people.
These are good things for the American people.
The president wants to see this get done, and that's why he's engaging with lawmakers today.
The president wants to see this get done, and that's why he's engaging with lawmakers today.
总统希望看到这件事完成，这就是为什么他今天与立法者进行交流的原因。
The president wants to see this get done, and that's why he's engaging with lawmakers today.
The president wants to see this get done, and that's why he's engaging with lawmakers today.
Follow-up on tariffs.
And just a quick follow-up on tariffs.
关于关税的快速跟进问题。
Follow-up on tariffs.
And just a quick follow-up on tariffs.
Kevin Hassett said today that the administration is prioritizing talks with Japan and South Korea, other trading partners.
Kevin Hassett said today that the administration is prioritizing talks with Japan and South Korea, other trading partners.
凯文·哈希特今天表示，政府正在优先与日本和韩国等贸易伙伴进行谈判。
Kevin Hassett said today that the administration is prioritizing talks with Japan and South Korea, other trading partners.
Kevin Hassett said today that the administration is prioritizing talks with Japan and South Korea, other trading partners.
Are there other countries on that list that you guys can name publicly that you're having serious discussions with?
Are there other countries on that list that you guys can name publicly that you're having serious discussions with?
你们是否能公开列出其他一些正在进行严肃讨论的国家？
Are there other countries on that list that you guys can name publicly that you're having serious discussions with?
Are there other countries on that list that you guys can name publicly that you're having serious discussions with? Sure.
当然可以。
Sure.
As you have heard from various administration officials, myself included, there have been nearly 70 countries that have reached out to the administration.
As you have heard from various administration officials, myself included, there have been nearly 70 countries that have reached out to the administration.
正如你从各个政府官员，包括我自己那里听到的那样，几乎有70个国家已经向政府发出了联络。
As you have heard from various administration officials, myself included, there have been nearly 70 countries that have reached out to the administration.
As you have heard from various administration officials, myself included, there have been nearly 70 countries that have reached out to the administration.
Last time I checked, but again, I hear the phones are ringing off the hook.
Last time I checked, but again, I hear the phones are ringing off the hook.
上次我检查的时候，但再次强调，我听说电话被打爆了。
Last time I checked, but again, I hear the phones are ringing off the hook.
Last time I checked, but again, I hear the phones are ringing off the hook.
There are foreign leaders who want to fly to Washington tonight and get on a plane to negotiate with this country, which shows you the leverage that the president is using.
There are foreign leaders who want to fly to Washington tonight and get on a plane to negotiate with this country, which shows you the leverage that the president is using.
有外国领导人想要今晚飞往华盛顿，并登上飞机与这个国家谈判，这表明总统正在使用的杠杆作用。
There are foreign leaders who want to fly to Washington tonight and get on a plane to negotiate with this country, which shows you the leverage that the president is using.
There are foreign leaders who want to fly to Washington tonight and get on a plane to negotiate with this country, which shows you the leverage that the president is using.
It shows you the rest of the world needs the United States of America to do business with.
It shows you the rest of the world needs the United States of America to do business with.
这表明全世界都需要美国进行贸易往来。
It shows you the rest of the world needs the United States of America to do business with.
It shows you the rest of the world needs the United States of America to do business with.
Israel, obviously yesterday you heard a public statement from Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Israel, obviously yesterday you heard a public statement from Prime Minister Netanyahu.
以色列，显然，昨天你听到了内塔尼亚胡总理的公开声明。
Israel, obviously yesterday you heard a public statement from Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Israel, obviously yesterday you heard a public statement from Prime Minister Netanyahu.
The president has detailed his calls with the leaders of Japan and South Korea.
The president has detailed his calls with the leaders of Japan and South Korea.
总统详细说明了他与日本和韩国领导人之间的通话情况。
The president has detailed his calls with the leaders of Japan and South Korea.
The president has detailed his calls with the leaders of Japan and South Korea.
We are going to prioritize our allies and our partners around the world first when it comes to these negotiations.
We are going to prioritize our allies and our partners around the world first when it comes to these negotiations.
在这些谈判中，我们首先会优先考虑我们的盟友和世界各地的伙伴。
We are going to prioritize our allies and our partners around the world first when it comes to these negotiations.
We are going to prioritize our allies and our partners around the world first when it comes to these negotiations.
The trade team will be divvying them up again to make tailor-made trade deals around the world.
And the trade team will be divvying them up again to make tailor-made trade deals around the world.
贸易团队将再次分配任务，制定出针对全球各地量身定制的贸易协议。
And the trade team will be divvying them up again to make tailor-made trade deals around the world.
And the trade team will be divvying them up again to make tailor-made trade deals around the world.
Ed, go ahead.
Ed, go ahead.
埃德，請繼續。
Ed, go ahead.
Ed, go ahead.
As promised.
As promised.
正如承諾的那樣。
As promised.
As promised.
You mentioned the 70 countries or so.
You mentioned the 70 countries or so.
你提到了大約70個國家。
You mentioned the 70 countries or so.
You mentioned the 70 countries or so.
I'm curious, though, under what conditions at this point would President Trump talk to President Xi about tariffs?
I'm curious, though, under what conditions at this point would President Trump talk to President Xi about tariffs?
不过，我很好奇，在什么条件下，特朗普总统现在会与习近平主席讨论关税问题？
I'm curious, though, under what conditions at this point would President Trump talk to President Xi about tariffs?
I'm curious, though, under what conditions at this point would President Trump talk to President Xi about tariffs?
Look, I just spoke to the president about this, and he believes that China wants to make a deal with the United States.
Look, I just spoke to the president about this, and he believes that China wants to make a deal with the United States.
听着，我刚刚和总统谈过这个问题，他认为中国希望与中国达成协议。
Look, I just spoke to the president about this, and he believes that China wants to make a deal with the United States.
Look, I just spoke to the president about this, and he believes that China wants to make a deal with the United States.
He believes China has to make a deal with the United States.
He believes China has to make a deal with the United States.
他相信中国必须与美国达成协议。
He believes China has to make a deal with the United States.
He believes China has to make a deal with the United States.
It was a mistake for China to retaliate.
It was a mistake for China to retaliate.
对华报复是个错误。
It was a mistake for China to retaliate.
It was a mistake for China to retaliate.
President, when America is punched, he punches back harder.
The president, when America is punched, he punches back harder.
当美国受到打击时，总统会回击得更狠。
The president, when America is punched, he punches back harder.
The president, when America is punched, he punches back harder.
That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect on China tonight at midnight.
That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect on China tonight at midnight.
这就是为什么今晚午夜对中国实施的关税将达到104%的原因。
That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect on China tonight at midnight.
That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect on China tonight at midnight.
But the president believes that Xi and China want to make a deal.
But the president believes that Xi and China want to make a deal.
但总统认为习近平和中国都希望达成协议。
But the president believes that she and China want to make a deal.
But the president believes that she and China want to make a deal.
They just don't know how to get that started.
They just don't know how to get that started.
他们只是不知道如何开始。
They just don't know how to get that started.
They just don't know how to get that started.
The president also wanted me to tell all of you that if China reaches out to make a deal, he'll be incredibly gracious, but he's going to do what's best for the American people.
And the president also wanted me to tell all of you that if China reaches out to make a deal, he'll be incredibly gracious, but he's going to do what's best for the American people.
总统还让我告诉你们，如果中国伸出援手，想要达成协议，他会非常慷慨大度的，但他会做对美国人民最好的事情。
And the president also wanted me to tell all of you that if China reaches out to make a deal, he'll be incredibly gracious, but he's going to do what's best for the American people.
And the president also wanted me to tell all of you that if China reaches out to make a deal, he'll be incredibly gracious, but he's going to do what's best for the American people.
China has to call first.
So China has to call first.
所以中国必须先打个电话。
China has to call first.
So China has to call first.
The Chinese want to make a deal.
The Chinese want to make a deal.
中国人希望达成协议。
The Chinese want to make a deal.
The Chinese want to make a deal.
They just don't know how to do it.
They just don't know how to do it.
他们只是不知道怎么做。
They just don't know how to do it.
They just don't know how to do it.
The president will be implementing these 104% tariffs on China tonight.
But the president will be implementing these 104% tariffs on China tonight.
但总统今晚将对华实施104%的关税。
But the president will be implementing these 104% tariffs on China tonight.
But the president will be implementing these 104% tariffs on China tonight.
Under what conditions might he consider lowering tariffs on China at this point?
I wonder what conditions might he consider lowering tariffs on China at this point.
我想知道，他现在会考虑降低对中国关税的条件是什么？
Under what conditions might he consider lowering tariffs on China at this point?
I wonder what conditions might he consider lowering tariffs on China at this point.
It would be imprudent of me to tell you those conditions here from the podium.
It would be imprudent of me to tell you those conditions here from the podium.
我在这里从讲台上告诉你，这些条件是不明智的。
It would be imprudent of me to tell you those conditions here from the podium.
It would be imprudent of me to tell you those conditions here from the podium.
Sure, Gabe.
Sure, Gabe.
当然，概不。
Sure, Gabe.
Sure, Gabe.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline.
谢谢你，卡罗琳。
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline.
With regards to the Supreme Court ruling on the Alien Enemies Act, you're right.
With regards to the Supreme Court ruling on the Alien Enemies Act, you're right.
关于最高法院对外国敌人法的裁决，你说的对。
With regards to the Supreme Court ruling on the Alien Enemies Act, you're right.
With regards to the Supreme Court ruling on the Alien Enemies Act, you're right.
It was a win for the administration.
It was a win for the administration.
这是对政府有利的判决。
It was a win for the administration.
It was a win for the administration.
But the justices also said that deportees are entitled to due process.
But the justices also said that deportees are entitled to due process.
但法官们也表示，被遣返者有权获得正当程序。
But the justices also said that deportees are entitled to due process.
But the justices also said that deportees are entitled to due process.
Does the administration agree with that?
Does the administration agree with that?
政府同意这一点吗？
Does the administration agree with that?
Does the administration agree with that?
That's not quite true, Gabe.
That's not quite true, Gabe.
这并不完全正确，概不。
That's not quite true, Gabe.
That's not quite true, Gabe.
They said that they are entitled to a habeas petition.
They said that they are entitled to a habeas petition.
他们说有权提出一项人身保护令申请。
They said that they are entitled to a habeas petition.
They said that they are entitled to a habeas petition.
And we are going to continue to comply with the law.
And we are going to continue to comply with the law.
我们会继续遵守法律。
And we are going to continue to comply with the law.
And we are going to continue to comply with the law.
And we are wholly confident that every single person that has been deported under the Alien Enemies Act, every person that will continue to be deported under the Alien Enemies Act, qualifies for that deportation.
And we are wholly confident that every single person that has been deported under the Alien Enemies Act, every person that will continue to be deported under the Alien Enemies Act, qualifies for that deportation.
我们完全相信，根据外国敌人法被遣返的每一个人，以及将要继续根据该法被遣返的每一个人，都符合被遣返的条件。
And we are wholly confident that every single person that has been deported under the Alien Enemies Act, every person that will continue to be deported under the Alien Enemies Act, qualifies for that deportation.
And we are wholly confident that every single person that has been deported under the Alien Enemies Act, every person that will continue to be deported under the Alien Enemies Act, qualifies for that deportation.
NBC News is reporting that the administration is considering drone strikes on drug cartels in Mexico. We're citing several officials.
NBC News is reporting that the administration is considering drone strikes on drug cartels in Mexico, citing several officials.
据美国全国广播公司新闻报道，政府正在考虑对墨西哥的贩毒集团发动无人机袭击，并引用了几名官员的说法。
NBC News is reporting that the administration is considering drone strikes on drug cartels in Mexico. We're citing several officials.
NBC News is reporting that the administration is considering drone strikes on drug cartels in Mexico, citing several officials.
This morning, Mexico's president was asked about that, and she said that we reject any of those actions.
This morning, Mexico's president was asked about that, and she said that we reject any of those actions.
今天早上，墨西哥总统被问及此事，他说：“我们拒绝任何此类行动。”
This morning, Mexico's president was asked about that, and she said that we reject any of those actions.
This morning, Mexico's president was asked about that, and she said that we reject any of those actions.
Your response?
Your response?
你的回应是什么？
Your response?
Your response?
I saw that reporting.
I saw that reporting.
我看到了那则报道。
I saw that reporting.
I saw that reporting.
I don't want to confirm it from this podium.
I don't want to confirm it from this podium.
我不希望从这个讲台确认此事。
I don't want to confirm it from this podium.
I don't want to confirm it from this podium.
I don't want to comment on it because I'm not sure.
I don't want to comment on it because I'm not sure.
我不想就此发表评论，因为我对此并不确定。
I don't want to comment on it because I'm not sure.
I don't want to comment on it because I'm not sure.
But I would defer you to the National Security Council.
But I would defer you to the National Security Council.
但我会将你转交给国家安全委员会。
But I would defer you to the National Security Council.
But I would defer you to the National Security Council.
So, you haven't confirmed the report, but with Mexico's president saying that she rejects any of that, what would your response be?
I mean, so you haven't confirmed the report, but with Mexico's president saying that she rejects any of that, what would your response be?
也就是说，你没有确认那则报道，但是墨西哥总统说他拒绝任何那样的行动，你的回应会是什么？
So, you haven't confirmed the report, but with Mexico's president saying that she rejects any of that, what would your response be?
I mean, so you haven't confirmed the report, but with Mexico's president saying that she rejects any of that, what would your response be?
How is the relationship then between Mexico's president and the White House right now over targeting drug cartels?
How's the relationship then between Mexico's president and the White House right now over targeting drug cartels?
那么，目前墨西哥总统与白宫在打击贩毒集团问题上的关系如何呢？
How is the relationship then between Mexico's president and the White House right now over targeting drug cartels?
How's the relationship then between Mexico's president and the White House right now over targeting drug cartels?
Well, first of all, the relationship between President Sheinbaum and President Trump is quite good.
Well, first of all, the relationship between President Sheinbaum and President Trump is quite good.
首先，谢恩鲍姆总统和特朗普总统之间的关系非常好。
Well, first of all, the relationship between President Sheinbaum and President Trump is quite good.
Well, first of all, the relationship between President Sheinbaum and President Trump is quite good.
And I think both world leaders would tell you that the president has been engaged directly with President Sheinbaum on a number of different topics, particularly when it comes to clamping down on the Mexican drug cartels, on clamping down on illegal immigration.
And I think both world leaders would tell you that the president has been engaged directly with President Sheinbaum on a number of different topics, particularly when it comes to clamping down on the Mexican drug cartels, on clamping down on illegal immigration.
而且我认为，两位世界领导人会告诉你，特朗普总统直接与谢恩鲍姆总统就多个不同话题进行了交流，尤其是在打击墨西哥贩毒集团和非法移民方面。
And I think both world leaders would tell you that the president has been engaged directly with President Sheinbaum on a number of different topics, particularly when it comes to clamping down on the Mexican drug cartels, on clamping down on illegal immigration.
And I think both world leaders would tell you that the president has been engaged directly with President Sheinbaum on a number of different topics, particularly when it comes to clamping down on the Mexican drug cartels, on clamping down on illegal immigration,
human trafficking, drug trafficking through our southern border.
Human trafficking, drug trafficking through our southern border.
以及人口贩卖、通过南部边境的毒品走私等问题。
Human trafficking, drug trafficking through our southern border.
Human trafficking, drug trafficking through our southern border.
She's taken significant steps towards doing that.
She's taken significant steps towards doing that.
她已经采取了重要措施来解决这些问题。
She's taken significant steps towards doing that.
She's taken significant steps towards doing that.
But as for that specific report, again, I'm not going to comment.
But as for that specific report, again, I'm not going to comment.
但是关于那则具体的报道，我再次不会发表评论。
But as for that specific report, again, I'm not going to comment.
But as for that specific report, again, I'm not going to comment.
Caroline.
Hi, Caroline.
你好，卡罗琳。
Caroline.
Hi, Caroline.
Two questions on trade.
Two questions on trade.
有2个贸易方面的问题。
Two questions on trade.
Two questions on trade.
First, as a part of these negotiations, is it possible for countries to lower their tariffs below that 10% bare minimum that's been set?
First, as a part of these negotiations, is it possible for countries to lower their tariffs below that 10% of their minimum that's been set?
首先，在这些谈判中，国家有可能将关税降至最低水平的10%以下吗？
First, as a part of these negotiations, is it possible for countries to lower their tariffs below that 10% bare minimum that's been set?
First, as a part of these negotiations, is it possible for countries to lower their tariffs below that 10% of their minimum that's been set?
Again, I'll leave that to the president to make those determinations.
Again, I'll leave that to the president to make those determinations.
在此，我将把决定权留给总统。
Again, I'll leave that to the president to make those determinations.
Again, I'll leave that to the president to make those determinations.
But I can tell you that 10% universal baseline will go into effect as these negotiations are ongoing.
But I can tell you that 10% universal baseline will go into effect as these negotiations are ongoing.
但可以告诉你的是，10%的普遍基准将在这些谈判进行时生效。
But I can tell you that 10% universal baseline will go into effect as these negotiations are ongoing.
But I can tell you that 10% universal baseline will go into effect as these negotiations are ongoing. Got it.
明白了。
Got it.
And then, what is your thinking just as far as low labor cost countries?
And then, what is your thinking just as far as low labor cost countries?
然后，就低劳动力成本国家而言，你的想法是什么？
And then, what is your thinking just as far as low labor cost countries?
And then, what is your thinking just as far as low labor cost countries?
Like if you've got a country like Vietnam that wants to negotiate, but obviously they have some advantages in terms of trade, in terms of the people there are not paid as much as American citizens. What is kind of the thinking?
Like, if you've got a country like Vietnam that wants to negotiate, but obviously they have some advantages in terms of trade, in terms of the people that are not paid as much as American citizens, what is kind of the thinking?
比如，如果你有一个国家像越南想要进行谈判，但显然在贸易和劳动力成本方面有优势，即他们的工人工资远低于美国公民，那么你的想法是什么？
Like if you've got a country like Vietnam that wants to negotiate, but obviously they have some advantages in terms of trade, in terms of the people there are not paid as much as American citizens. What is kind of the thinking?
Like, if you've got a country like Vietnam that wants to negotiate, but obviously they have some advantages in terms of trade, in terms of the people that are not paid as much as American citizens, what is kind of the thinking?
Can they still achieve a good kind of trade outcome with the United States?
Can they still achieve a good kind of trade outcome with the United States?
他们是否仍然能够与美国达成一个良好的贸易结果呢？
Can they still achieve a good kind of trade outcome with the United States?
Can they still achieve a good kind of trade outcome with the United States?
Again, you're right to point out that different countries have different labor markets.
Well, again, you're right to point out that different countries have different labor markets.
在此，你指出了不同国家有不同的劳动力市场。
Well, again, you're right to point out that different countries have different labor markets.
Well, again, you're right to point out that different countries have different labor markets.
They have different skills, if you will, different resources.
They have different skills, if you will, different resources.
他们有不同技能和资源。
They have different skills, if you will, different resources.
They have different skills, if you will, different resources.
And the president is going to take all of that into account.
And the president is going to take all of that into account.
总统会考虑到所有这些因素的。
And the president is going to take all of that into account.
And the president is going to take all of that into account.
His team will take all of that into account when they're negotiating these deals.
His team will take all of that into account when they're negotiating these deals.
他的团队在谈判交易时会考虑所有这些因素。
His team will take all of that into account when they're negotiating these deals.
His team will take all of that into account when they're negotiating these deals.
I do just want to point out one thing, that the president, everybody in Washington, whether they want to admit it or not, knows that this president is right when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to trade.
I do just want to point out one thing, that the president, everybody in Washington, whether they want to admit it or not, knows that this president is right when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to trade.
我想指出一件事，总统，华盛顿的每一个人，无论他们是否愿意承认，都知道在关税和贸易问题上，这位总统是正确的。
I do just want to point out one thing, that the president, everybody in Washington, whether they want to admit it or not, knows that this president is right when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to trade.
I do just want to point out one thing, that the president, everybody in Washington, whether they want to admit it or not, knows that this president is right when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to trade.
In fact, Democrats have long said that the United States of America has been ripped off by the countries around the world.
In fact, Democrats have long said that the United States of America has been ripped off by the countries around the world.
事实上，民主党人长期以来一直说美国被世界各国剥削了。
In fact, Democrats have long said that the United States of America has been ripped off by the countries around the world.
In fact, Democrats have long said that the United States of America has been ripped off by the countries around the world.
They just don't want to admit it now because it's President Trump who is saying that.
They just don't want to admit it now because it's President Trump who is saying that.
他们现在不承认，是因为是特朗普总统在这么说。
They just don't want to admit it now because it's President Trump who is saying that.
They just don't want to admit it now because it's President Trump who is saying that.
In June of 1996, Nancy Pelosi spoke on the House floor.
In June of 1996, Nancy Pelosi spoke on the House floor.
1996年6月，南希·佩洛西在众议院发言。
In June of 1996, Nancy Pelosi spoke on the House floor.
In June of 1996, Nancy Pelosi spoke on the House floor.
She urged her colleagues at the time to fight against the status quo trade policies that had contributed to America's trade deficit with China.
She urged her colleagues at the time to fight against the status quo trade policies that had contributed to America's trade deficit with China.
她敦促她的同事们反对那些导致美国对华贸易逆差的现状贸易政策。
She urged her colleagues at the time to fight against the status quo trade policies that had contributed to America's trade deficit with China.
She urged her colleagues at the time to fight against the status quo trade policies that had contributed to America's trade deficit with China.
In fact, Nancy Pelosi said, "How far does China have to go?"
In fact, Nancy Pelosi said, "How far does China have to go?"
事实上，南希·佩洛西说，中国还需要走多远？
In fact, Nancy Pelosi said, "How far does China have to go?"
In fact, Nancy Pelosi said, "How far does China have to go?"
How much more repression?
How much more repression?
还要多少镇压？
How much more repression?
How much more repression?
How big a trade deficit?
How big a trade deficit?
贸易逆差还要有多大？
How big a trade deficit?
How big a trade deficit?
How many jobs have to be lost for the American workers?
How many jobs have to be lost for the American workers?
美国工人要失去多少工作？
How many jobs have to be lost for the American workers?
How many jobs have to be lost for the American workers?
How much dangerous proliferation has to exist before members of this House of Representatives will say, "I will not endorse the status quo"?
How much dangerous proliferation has to exist before members of this House of Representatives will say, "I will not endorse the status quo"?
在座的众议员们要看到多大的危险扩散，才会说我不会支持现状了。
How much dangerous proliferation has to exist before members of this House of Representatives will say, "I will not endorse the status quo"?
How much dangerous proliferation has to exist before members of this House of Representatives will say, "I will not endorse the status quo"?
Those are the words of Nancy Pelosi in 1996. Well, President Trump is finally answering her call 27 years later.
Those are the words of Nancy Pelosi in 1996, while President Trump is finally answering her call 27 years later.
这是南希·佩洛西在1996年说的话，而特朗普总统终于在27年后回应了他的呼吁。
Those are the words of Nancy Pelosi in 1996. Well, President Trump is finally answering her call 27 years later.
Those are the words of Nancy Pelosi in 1996, while President Trump is finally answering her call 27 years later.
Nancy Pelosi can thank President Trump today for the 104% retaliatory tariff that will be going into effect on China.
Nancy Pelosi can thank President Trump today for the 104% retaliatory tariff that will be going into effect on China.
今天，南希·佩洛西可以感谢特朗普总统对华实施的报复性关税将高达104%。
Nancy Pelosi can thank President Trump today for the 104% retaliatory tariff that will be going into effect on China.
Nancy Pelosi can thank President Trump today for the 104% retaliatory tariff that will be going into effect on China.
2007, Chuck Schumer spoke of our nation's crippling trade deficit, saying these are the kinds of records the American people don't want us to be breaking.
In 2007, Chuck Schumer spoke of our nation's crippling trade deficit, saying these are the kinds of records the American people don't want us to be breaking.
在2007年，查克·舒默谈到了我们国家令人崩溃的贸易逆差，他说这些都是美国人不想让我们打破的记录。
In 2007, Chuck Schumer spoke of our nation's crippling trade deficit, saying these are the kinds of records the American people don't want us to be breaking.
In 2007, Chuck Schumer spoke of our nation's crippling trade deficit, saying these are the kinds of records the American people don't want us to be breaking.
The administration needs to move beyond words, take action now to reverse a trend that threatens our prospects for future economic growth.
The administration needs to move beyond words, take action now to reverse a trend that threatens our prospects for future economic growth.
政府需要超越言辞，现在就采取行动，扭转可能威胁未来经济增长前景的趋势。
The administration needs to move beyond words, take action now to reverse a trend that threatens our prospects for future economic growth.
The administration needs to move beyond words, take action now to reverse a trend that threatens our prospects for future economic growth.
And Chuck Schumer said that in 2007.
And Chuck Schumer said that in 2007.
查克·舒默在2007年说过这话。
And Chuck Schumer said that in 2007.
And Chuck Schumer said that in 2007.
Finally, in 2025, President Trump is taking action.
Finally, in 2025, President Trump is taking action.
终于，在2025年，特朗普总统采取了行动。
Finally, in 2025, President Trump is taking action.
Finally, in 2025, President Trump is taking action.
Recently defeated Democrat Sherrod Brown said on deficits in 2012 that our deficit then at China had reached an all-time high.
Recently defeated Democrat Sherrod Brown said on deficits in 2012 that our deficit then at China had reached an all-time high.
最近落败的民主党人谢罗德·布朗在2012年说过，当时对中国的赤字达到了历史最高点。
Recently defeated Democrat Sherrod Brown said on deficits in 2012 that our deficit then at China had reached an all-time high.
Recently defeated Democrat Sherrod Brown said on deficits in 2012 that our deficit then at China had reached an all-time high.
And it was on pace to recede.
And it was on pace to recede.
而且它正有放缓的趋势。
And it was on pace to recede.
And it was on pace to recede.
Last year's record, the trade deficit had cost American workers millions of jobs at the time.
Last year's record, the trade deficit had cost American workers millions of jobs at the time.
去年的记录显示，当时的贸易逆差导致美国工人失去了数百万个工作岗位。
Last year's record, the trade deficit had cost American workers millions of jobs at the time.
Last year's record, the trade deficit had cost American workers millions of jobs at the time.
These are the words of Democrats years ago.
These are the words of Democrats years ago.
这些都是民主党人多年前说过的话。
These are the words of Democrats years ago.
These are the words of Democrats years ago.
It is about time America finally has a president who is taking action to restore those millions of jobs back to the United States of America to boost our manufacturing industry.
It is about time America finally has a president who is taking action to restore those millions of jobs back to the United States of America to boost our manufacturing industry.
是时候让美国有一位总统采取行动，将数百万个工作岗位带回美国，提振我们的制造业了。
It is about time America finally has a president who is taking action to restore those millions of jobs back to the United States of America to boost our manufacturing industry.
It is about time America finally has a president who is taking action to restore those millions of jobs back to the United States of America to boost our manufacturing industry.
He's doing what's right for the American people.
He's doing what's right for the American people.
他正在为美国人民做正确的事情。
He's doing what's right for the American people.
He's doing what's right for the American people.
It will take a lot of labor.
It will take a lot of labor.
这需要大量的劳动力。
It will take a lot of labor.
It will take a lot of labor.
It will take a lot of effort.
It will take a lot of effort.
这将需要大量的努力。
It will take a lot of effort.
It will take a lot of effort.
That's exactly what the American people elected this president to do.
That's exactly what the American people elected this president to do.
这就是美国人民选举这位总统的目的。
That's exactly what the American people elected this president to do.
That's exactly what the American people elected this president to do.
He will be talking about our energy agenda at 3 o'clock today over in the East Room.
He will be talking about our energy agenda at 3 o'clock today over in the East Room.
他将在今天下午3点在东厅谈论我们的能源议程。
He will be talking about our energy agenda at 3 o'clock today over in the East Room.
He will be talking about our energy agenda at 3 o'clock today over in the East Room.
As you all know, he will be signing a bill to unleash the might of our beautiful, clean coal industry in this country, which is a reliable energy source also for AI.
As you all know, he will be signing a bill to unleash the might of our beautiful, clean coal industry in this country, which is a reliable energy source also for AI.
正如你们所知，他将签署一项法案，释放我们这个国家美丽、清洁的煤炭产业的力量，这也是 AI 可靠的能源来源。
As you all know, he will be signing a bill to unleash the might of our beautiful, clean coal industry in this country, which is a reliable energy source also for AI.
As you all know, he will be signing a bill to unleash the might of our beautiful, clean coal industry in this country, which is a reliable energy source also for AI.
There's a great story in Bloomberg today, actually, about the executive order that will be signed later.
There's a great story in Bloomberg today, actually, about the executive order that will be signed later.
实际上，彭博社今天有一篇关于稍后将签署的行政命令的好文章。
There's a great story in Bloomberg today, actually, about the executive order that will be signed later.
There's a great story in Bloomberg today, actually, about the executive order that will be signed later.
So we'll see you all there.
So we'll see you all there.
所以，我们会在那里见到大家。
So we'll see you all there.
So we'll see you all there.
I'll let the president speak more.
I'll let the president speak more.
我让总统多说几句。
I'll let the president speak more.
I'll let the president speak more.
See you later.
We'll see you later.
稍后见。
We'll see you later.
We'll see you later.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
谢谢，伙计们。
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
本次节目到这里就结束了。如果你喜欢这种英文练习方式的话，可以考虑订阅我们的频道，然后在底下按赞并分享出去。有什么建议，也可以在留言区告诉我们，让我们产出更符合您期望的影片。我们下次再见，拜拜。